A heartless millionaire showed his true colors when he abandoned his wife after she became disabled in an accident. Ready to start fresh with a new marriage, he never expected the mandatory DNA test to turn his world upside down. The results revealed an unthinkable truth. The wife he abandoned was actually his long-lost half-sister, separated at birth. Now he must live with the guilt of betraying his only blood relative when she needed him most. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The penthouse suite shimmered, a cold, opulent cage. Arthur, in a silk robe the color of clotted cream, surveyed his kingdom. The sprawling cityscape spread below, a miniature replica of his own ambition. He sipped lukewarm champagne, the bubbles a mocking echo of his empty life. Isabella, his wife, lay in the hospital, her once vibrant spirit dimmed by the brutal accident. He hadn't visited in days. The guilt, a dull ache behind his eyes, was easily drowned in the relentless tide of self-indulgence. He'd met Isabella at a charity gala, her laughter a bright spark against the backdrop of carefully cultivated boredom. Their marriage, a dazzling facade, had crumbled under the weight of his indifference. Her injury, a fractured spine and shattered dreams, exposed the hollowness beneath the gilded surface of his existence. He saw the fear in her eyes, the desperate clinging to his hand, as the doctors delivered the devastating diagnosis, and a cold dread, far greater than mere responsibility, washed over him. He couldn't bear it. He couldn't face it. The city lights blurred through the expensive crystal glass. He felt a prickle of unease, a premonition of what lay ahead, a shadowy uncertainty that the champagne couldn't quite erase. His impending marriage to Veronica, young and ambitious, a woman who mirrored his own shallow desires, loomed like a looming storm cloud. The DNA test, a mandatory prerequisite for the prenuptial agreement, hung over him, a sword of Damocles threatening to sever the carefully crafted illusion of his life. He was running, but from what? From himself? From the truth buried deep beneath layers of wealth and denial? The answer, he knew, was far more terrifying than he dared to imagine. The lawyer, Mr. Finch, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with weary observation, arrived precisely at noon. His briefcase, worn leather whispering tales of countless hushed negotiations, sat on Arthur's polished mahogany desk, a stark contrast to the vibrant orchids arranged in a crystal vase. The results are unexpected, Mr. Beaumont. Finch began, his voice a low rumble, the words hanging heavy in the opulent silence. Arthur, perched on the edge of his designer chair, felt a tremor run through him, a premonition of a storm breaking. The champagne, usually a source of effortless solace, tasted like ash in his mouth. Unexpected how? Arthur managed, his voice a tight thread. He felt a clammy sweat clinging to his skin despite the perfectly controlled temperature of the room. The city lights, usually a breathtaking spectacle, felt oppressive, mirroring the weight settling upon his chest. Finch pushed a slim folder across the desk. The crisp paper felt cold against Arthur's fingers. He opened it, his eyes skimming the clinical jargon, his breath catching in his throat. The stark simplicity of the conclusion hit him like a physical blow. 50% genetic match. Isabella, his wife, his sister. The room tilted, the opulent surroundings blurred, the familiar comfort replaced by a nauseating sense of unreality. The scent of the orchids, once a pleasant fragrance, now seemed cloying, suffocating. He felt a wave of dizziness, the world swimming before his eyes. He had abandoned her, left her to her suffering, and she was his blood, his only blood. This can't be right, Arthur stammered, his voice cracking. The words felt hollow even to his own ears. He clutched the folder, the paper crinkling under his trembling grip. He saw Isabella's face in his mind, her eyes, once bright with laughter, now clouded with a profound sadness that mirrored his own growing horror. He had betrayed her, not just as a husband, but as a sibling. The betrayal resonated with an even sharper pang of guilt. His carefully constructed world, built on ambition and self-interest, was crumbling around him. The weight of his actions, previously masked by wealth and indifference, now crushed him under its immense burden. The looming storm had arrived, and it was far more devastating than he had ever imagined. The lawyer's words echoed in Arthur's ears, a relentless hammer against the fragile edifice of his life. The opulent penthouse, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a gilded cage. He stared at the DNA report, the stark percentage of brand on his soul. 50%. Half of him, a part he'd discarded, left to wither in the shadows of his callous indifference. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, the city lights a blurry smear through his tears. The champagne flute, still half full, mocked him with its untouched contents. The city's glittering facade felt cruelly indifferent to his inner turmoil. A hollow ache gnawed at him, a visceral pain that transcended the physical. He sank into a plush armchair, the soft leather offering no comfort. The weight of his actions pressed down, suffocating him. He closed his eyes. Isabella's face, pale, weakened, but still possessing a quiet dignity, floated before him. He remembered her laughter, the warmth of her hand in his, the love he had so carelessly thrown away. Now, that memory was laced with the bitter knowledge of blood kinship, a connection he had brutally severed. He picked up the phone, the polished surface cool against his trembling fingers. He dialed a number, his voice a shaky whisper when the operator answered. "Mr. Finch," he said, his voice barely audible. I need to see Isabella." The words felt alien, clumsy, inadequate to express the tidal wave of remorse crashing over him. The phone felt heavy, the silence on the other end a stark reflection of the vast chasm he had created between himself and the woman who was both his wife and his sister. His world, once so meticulously crafted, lay in ruins, the fragments sharp and unforgiving under the harsh light of the truth. The opulent room, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb, reflecting the death of his carefully constructed self. He felt utterly and completely alone. The plush armchair swallowed him, its softness a cruel mockery of his inner turmoil. The city lights, a dazzling spectacle from his penthouse window, held no allure. They were merely distant pinpricks of light against a vast, indifferent darkness mirroring the emptiness within him. The scent of expensive cologne, usually a comforting familiarity, now felt suffocating, a cloying reminder of the superficiality that had defined his life. He hadn't slept properly in days, his mind a relentless carousel of images. Isabella's weakened frame, her haunted eyes, the sterile scent of the hospital, the chilling finality of the DNA report. His phone, a sleek, obsidian rectangle, felt heavy in his trembling hand. The number he dialed, Isabella's, seemed miles away, a chasm of his own making. He imagined her voice, soft and brittle, tinged with a weariness that went beyond physical pain. Would she even answer? Would she want to speak to him? "Hello." Her voice, thin as spun glass, shattered the silence. He cleared his throat, the sound raspy and unfamiliar. "Isabella, it's Arthur." A pause. A silence thick with unspoken accusations, unanswered questions, and a lifetime of regret. He could almost hear her breathing, shallow and labored, a painful counterpoint to the opulent silence of his apartment. I need to see you," he stammered, the words catching in his throat. The admission, simple as it was, felt monumental, a confession ripped from his soul. Another pause. He braced himself for rejection, for the sharp sting of deserved anger. Instead, he heard a sigh, a soft exhale that hinted at exhaustion, but also something else. A flicker of hope, perhaps, or was it merely resignation? "Tomorrow," she whispered, her voice barely audible. At 3, the line went dead. He remained rooted to the spot, the disconnected phone a cold weight in his hand. Tomorrow. A single word, a fragile bridge across the chasm of his destruction. He had a chance, however slim, to begin the arduous process of repair. But the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty, paved with the jagged stones of guilt and the chilling awareness of his betrayal. The weight of his actions pressed down, suffocating him, yet a faint spark of hope flickered in the suffocating darkness. A tiny ember in the ruins of his self-constructed world. The following day, the city's relentless hum felt muted, a distant drone against the pounding in Arthur's chest. He arrived at Isabella's modest apartment building, a stark contrast to his opulent penthouse. The air smelled of freshly baked bread and something vaguely floral, a comforting domesticity miles removed from his sterile, perfumed world. He pressed the buzzer, his hand trembling. The wait felt like an eternity. Each second stretched, laden with the weight of his past actions. Finally, the door clicked open, revealing Isabella in a wheelchair. Her face was pale, etched with lines of weariness, but her eyes, though shadowed, held a surprising strength. She wore a simple but elegant dress, a testament to a quiet dignity that belied her circumstances. "Come in," she said, her voice soft but firm, the tone devoid of warmth, yet not overtly hostile. The apartment was small, but impeccably clean, filled with sunlight and a sense of calm defiance. A single vase of lilies sat on a small table, their delicate fragrance a poignant counterpoint to the heavy silence. Arthur entered, the silence amplifying the unspoken accusations hanging between them. He cleared his throat, the sound swallowed by the quiet of the room. I'm so sorry, Isabella, for everything." She looked away, her gaze fixed on the lilies. "Saying sorry doesn't change what you did, Arthur. It doesn't erase the pain." Her voice was low, each word weighted with years of unspoken hurt. A tear traced a path down her cheek, unnoticed by him in his own turmoil. The silence stretched again, thick and heavy, filled only with the gentle rustling of the lilies in the soft breeze drifting in from the open window. He watched her, a torrent of emotions, guilt, shame, remorse washing over him. This wasn't the picture of effortless wealth he was used to. This was raw vulnerability, quiet strength in the face of adversity. The woman he'd abandoned was not just a wife. She was his sister. The realization hit him with a fresh wave of sickening horror. He had abandoned his only family. He'd chosen self-preservation over the very essence of kinship. The weight of that betrayal nearly crushed him. He wanted to apologize, to plead, to beg for forgiveness, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. He could only offer a heavy silence, the profound silence of a man grappling with the shattering of his carefully built illusion of a perfect life. The apartment, once a simple space, now felt like a sanctuary, a refuge from the storm raging inside him. The lilies, previously just flowers, felt like a beacon of fragile hope amidst the wreckage of his life. The silence, no longer heavy, was merely an atmosphere of shared sorrow, a space for the next step, however difficult it might be. The scent of lilies, sharp and sweet, hung in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile scent of Arthur's penthouse. He shifted uncomfortably in the small, worn armchair, the plush velvet a jarring difference from the simple, floral-patterned couch beneath Isabella. Sunlight streamed through the lace-curtained window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. It was a peaceful scene, utterly at odds with the tempest raging within him. Isabella sat opposite, her gaze fixed on her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. The pale skin was marred by faint, almost invisible scars, a testament to the accident that had shattered both their lives. He watched her, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, each tick a hammer blow against his guilt. I didn't know," he finally stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The words felt inadequate, a pathetic attempt to bridge the chasm of his betrayal. Isabella remained silent, her shoulders hunched, a small, almost imperceptible tremor running through her. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, a physical weight pressing down on Arthur. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, a constriction that had become his constant companion since the DNA results. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, then retreated, the movement mirroring his internal conflict. The desire to touch her, to offer some semblance of comfort, battled with the overwhelming shame of his past actions. Knowing wouldn't have changed anything, she finally said, her voice barely audible. Her eyes remained downcast, the lashes casting shadows on her cheeks. You chose to leave. You chose convenience. The accusation was sharp, precise, piercing through his carefully constructed defenses. He opened his mouth to protest, to offer some explanation, some mitigation, but no words came. The truth hung between them, heavy and undeniable. He had chosen convenience, choosing self-preservation over the loyalty he owed his only blood relative. The full weight of his actions crashed down on him, suffocating him with its enormity. He watched her, a woman he'd once dismissed as an inconvenience, a woman who now embodied quiet strength and unwavering dignity. He had destroyed her life, and with it, a bond he had never even known existed. The lilies, still vibrant in their vase, felt like a symbol of the beauty he had so carelessly trampled underfoot. The silence returned, heavier now, thick with unspoken sorrow and the bitter taste of regret. The lawyer, Mr. Finch, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with an expression of weary wisdom, cleared his throat. The mahogany of his desk gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, reflecting the turmoil in Arthur's eyes. The results are conclusive, Mr. Blackwood, he said, his voice low, a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. Arthur felt a tremor run through him, a physical manifestation of the fear coiling in his gut. The crisp air conditioning did nothing to quell the rising heat on his skin. Outside, the city hummed, a distant, muffled roar that felt oddly disconnected from the suffocating silence in the room. Arthur stared at the official-looking document, the stark black lettering blurring into a meaningless jumble. His carefully constructed world, built on ambition and a relentless pursuit of pleasure, was crumbling around him. The denial, sharp and immediate, was a desperate attempt to stave off the implications. This couldn't be true. Simply couldn't. There must be a mistake, he finally managed, his voice a strained whisper. He felt a cold sweat prickling his skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of the expensive suit he wore. The tailored fabric felt suddenly suffocating, a gilded cage around his growing panic. Finch pushed a tissue box across the desk, his gaze unwavering. I assure you, Mr. Blackwood, the lab is renowned for its accuracy. The DNA analysis leaves no room for doubt. Arthur swallowed hard, the lump in his throat constricting his breathing. The taste of bile rose in the back of his throat, bitter and acrid. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, the gesture shattering the composure he had painstakingly cultivated. The polished image, so carefully maintained, was cracking under the strain of this shattering revelation. His carefully constructed life, his new marriage, his entire future. It all hung precariously, balanced on the edge of a precipice. The weight of it pressed down on him, crushing the breath from his lungs. The silence in the room stretched, heavy and suffocating, filled only with the rhythmic drumming of his own heart. He felt utterly alone, the vastness of his wealth offering no solace, no escape from the truth that was slowly, inexorably, engulfing him. Isabella, his sister, the woman he had abandoned. The guilt, sharp and raw, began to claw at him, a relentless tide threatening to drown him in its icy depths. The air hung heavy with the unspoken. Arthur stared at the paper, the stark black lettering a mocking testament to his shattered life. The lawyer, Mr. Finch, watched him with an almost clinical detachment, the silence amplifying Arthur's internal turmoil. The opulent office, usually a symbol of his power, felt like a suffocating cage. The scent of expensive leather and polished wood suddenly turned cloying, a grotesque reminder of his superficial existence. I need time, Arthur finally croaked, his voice raw with a desperation he couldn't conceal. The carefully constructed facade of control crumbled further, revealing the terrified man beneath. His fingers, usually manicured and pristine, trembled as he reached for a glass of water, the crystal cold against his clammy skin. Finch nodded, a subtle shift in his posture suggesting a reluctant understanding. Of course, Mr. Blackwood, However, the prenuptial agreement. He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. The implication was clear. Arthur's impending marriage, his carefully planned future, was now irrevocably compromised. Arthur felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The champagne wishes and caviar dreams of his new life evaporated, replaced by a bitter taste of betrayal and self-loathing. He envisioned Isabella's face, her once radiant smile now overshadowed by the cruel hand of fate. The guilt, a burning brand on his soul, intensified. He had abandoned her, his own flesh and blood, to languish in her suffering while he pursued a life of reckless hedonism. The thought was a physical blow, leaving him gasping for air. The mahogany desk, usually a symbol of his authority, now felt like a cold, unyielding judge, silently condemning him. The rhythmic ticking of the clock, a constant companion in his life of luxury, now echoed in his ears like a relentless hammer, each beat a reminder of time slipping away, lost opportunities for redemption. He glanced at the window, the city lights blurring into a meaningless spectacle. His reflection stared back, a stranger in an expensive suit, his eyes haunted by a darkness he couldn't outrun. The city that once symbolized his triumph now mocked him with its indifferent grandeur, a cold, unforgiving backdrop to his personal devastation. The weight of his actions, the magnitude of his betrayal, pressed down on him, threatening to crush him under its immense weight. He was alone, truly alone, and the realization was a chilling, bone-deep despair. The lawyer, Mr. Finch, cleared his throat, the sound surprisingly loud in the suffocating silence. "Mr. Blackwood," he began, his voice low and measured. "There are complications regarding the prenuptial agreement. Given the unexpected results of the DNA test, certain clauses become problematic." Arthur stared blankly at the ornate Persian rug, its intricate design blurring into a meaningless swirl. The champagne he'd been nursing felt like acid in his stomach. He hadn't touched the expensive canapes laid out on the silver platter. The caviar seemed to mock him with its decadent excess. The opulent penthouse apartment, usually a source of pride, now felt like a gilded cage, its gilded bars tightening around him. Problematic how? Arthur finally managed, his voice a dry rasp. The words felt alien, detached from the churning chaos within him. Finch adjusted his spectacles, his gaze unwavering. "Well, sir, the agreement stipulates a clean break from any previous relationships. Given the familial connection, it raises some rather significant legal questions." He paused, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. The city lights twinkled mockingly beyond the panoramic windows. Arthur ran a hand through his meticulously styled hair, disarranging the perfect waves. His reflection stared back at him, a stranger in a tailored suit, his eyes hollowed by a sudden and unexpected weight. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Not only had he betrayed Isabella, but he'd also knowingly entered into a contract designed to protect him from precisely this kind of revelation. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. "So, what happens now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, a stark contrast to his usual booming commands. He felt exposed, vulnerable, stripped bare of the carefully constructed armor of wealth and privilege. The city, once a symbol of his conquest, now felt like an indifferent, looming threat. Finch offered a sympathetic, yet professional, nod. "We need to proceed with caution, Mr. Blackwood. There will be legal ramifications, both personal and financial. I strongly advise you to seek counsel immediately." He produced a business card, its crisp edges a jarring contrast to the turmoil tearing Arthur apart. The crispness was a mockery of the shattered fragments of his life. The weight of his actions, the devastation he'd wrought, pressed down on him with agonizing force. The opulent apartment, once a sanctuary of comfort, now felt like a tomb. He was alone, trapped in the suffocating silence of his self-made prison. The penthouse apartment, usually a beacon of glittering excess, felt claustrophobic. The scent of expensive lilies, normally soothing, now hung heavy and cloying in the air. Arthur paced, the polished marble floor cold beneath his bare feet, the chill seeping into his very bones. He'd poured himself another glass of champagne, the bubbles mocking his inner turmoil. It wasn't the legal ramifications that chilled him, the money he could handle. It was the sickening realization that the woman he'd discarded, the woman he'd treated with such callous indifference, was his own flesh and blood. He stopped pacing, staring out at the glittering cityscape. The twinkling lights, once symbols of his power and success, now seemed to taunt him with their indifferent brilliance. He picked up a photograph from the nearby table, a glossy shot of himself and Veronica, his fiancée, radiating false happiness. Her bright smile felt like a cruel accusation, a painful reminder of his deception. He tossed the photo onto a silk cushion, the impact barely audible in the oppressive silence. A low sob escaped his lips, a sound so unlike him, so uncharacteristic of the man he presented to the world, that it startled him. He sank into a plush velvet armchair, the luxurious fabric offering no comfort. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, an unbearable burden. He hadn't just abandoned a wife. He'd abandoned his sister, his only blood relative, in her hour of need. God, he whispered, the sound swallowed by the vast emptiness of the apartment. The guilt was a physical entity, a heavy cloak wrapping itself around him, suffocating him with its weight. He thought of Isabella, her pale face etched with pain, her eyes filled with a heartbreaking sorrow he had ignored, dismissed, condemned to the dusty recesses of his conscience. He had chosen wealth, comfort, youth over familial loyalty, and the price, he now understood, was far greater than he could have ever imagined. The champagne, once a symbol of celebration, now tasted like ashes. The opulent setting, once a source of pride, now felt like a cruel, self-imposed punishment. He was trapped, not in a gilded cage, but in a prison of his own making, the bars forged from his own heartless choices. The silence pressed in, broken only by the rhythmic thud of his own accelerating heart. The lawyer, Mr. Finch, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the weariness of witnessing human folly, arrived precisely at noon. Arthur, dressed in a silk robe that did little to conceal his inner turmoil, poured him a glass of the same lukewarm champagne he'd been nursing for hours. The crystal clinked, a brittle sound against the backdrop of Arthur's mounting dread. The results are conclusive, Finch began, his tone devoid of any unnecessary drama, a stark contrast to the tempest raging within Arthur. Arthur didn't speak, couldn't speak. The city outside, a shimmering tapestry of light and shadow, reflected the turmoil in his soul. He felt a cold sweat prickling his skin despite the warmth of the apartment. The expensive Persian rug beneath his feet felt suddenly rough, alien. Finch cleared his throat. The DNA test confirms a half-sibling relationship between you and Isabella. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Arthur's breath hitched. His carefully constructed world, built on ambition and the cold calculation of self-preservation, crumbled into dust. The champagne, now tepid and flat, felt like bitter poison on his tongue. He stared at the swirling amber liquid, seeing not a celebratory drink, but a murky reflection of his own depravity. He had abandoned her, his sister, in her time of need. The thought was a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left him gasping for air. He could almost hear Isabella's soft voice, laced with a pain he had willfully ignored. He closed his eyes, the image of her pale face, weakened but somehow stronger than he'd ever been, flashing before him. The guilt was a relentless tide, pulling him under, drowning him in the icy waters of his own self-loathing. I need a moment, he finally managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. The silence that followed was deafening, filled only with the relentless drumming of his own heart, a frantic tattoo against the quiet elegance of his penthouse. The opulent surroundings mocked him, highlighting the stark contrast between his external riches and his profound inner poverty. The weight of his betrayal felt unbearable, a crushing weight that threatened to crush him completely. He was alone, utterly and completely alone, with the chilling truth of his actions. The impending marriage, once a symbol of triumph, now felt like an obscene joke. The opulent penthouse, usually a sanctuary of self-indulgence, felt like a gilded cage. Arthur paced, the Persian rug a soft but unforgiving cushion beneath his restless feet. The city lights, usually a dazzling spectacle, now seemed to mock his despair. He swirled the remaining champagne, its bubbles a pathetic mimicry of the turmoil within him. Finch, observing from a plush armchair, remained impassive, a statue carved from granite. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hall, each chime a hammer blow to Arthur's already fractured psyche. Finally, Arthur stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping. He ran a hand through his impeccably styled hair, the gesture betraying the unraveling of his composure. What does this mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, a stark contrast to his usual commanding tone. Finch, without preamble, placed a file on the low table. "It means, Mr. Blackwood, that the woman you abandoned is your half-sister." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. Arthur stared at the file, its crisp pages a mocking representation of the order he craved, an order he had so brutally shattered. The opulent apartment, with its carefully curated art and priceless antiques, seemed to shrink around him, the walls closing in, suffocating him. He felt a wave of nausea, the champagne rising in his throat. He fought it back, his face paling. The image of Isabella, frail but defiant, flashed before his eyes, a stark contrast to the young, ambitious woman waiting for him at the altar. His carefully constructed future crumbled, replaced by the sickening realization of his profound betrayal. I didn't know," he stammered, the words a pathetic attempt at self-justification. The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. He knew, on some level he always had, the shared stubbornness, the way they both tilted their heads when considering something, were now chilling echoes of a shared past he had deliberately ignored. Finch's gaze, though still devoid of overt emotion, held a hint of something akin to pity. "Perhaps not consciously, Mr. Blackwood, but the DNA doesn't lie." The lawyer's tone was not accusatory, but simply stating a fact, a cold, hard truth that stripped Arthur bare. The weight of his actions, the depth of his selfishness, pressed down on him, threatening to crush him utterly. The city lights, a symbol of his success, seemed to dim, leaving him alone in the suffocating darkness of his own making. His breath hitched, a silent sob trapped in his throat. The carefully crafted illusion of his perfect life had shattered, leaving behind only the bitter taste of guilt and the agonizing awareness of his profound betrayal. The lawyer, Finch, a man whose impassivity was as meticulously crafted as Arthur's tailored suits, tapped a pen against the mahogany desk. The air in his sterile office, usually scented with expensive leather and old paper, felt thick with unspoken accusations. Arthur, perched on the edge of a stiff, uncomfortable chair, felt the plush fabric of his trousers digging into his thighs, a small but insistent discomfort mirroring the turmoil inside. Outside, the city hummed, a relentless symphony of indifference to his impending doom. "The test results," Finch began, his voice a low, measured rumble, "are conclusive." He pushed a folder across the desk, the crisp white paper a stark contrast to the swirling vortex of anxiety in Arthur's gut. He didn't touch it, couldn't. The silence stretched, a taut, elastic band threatening to snap. Arthur could taste the metallic tang of fear on his tongue, a premonition of the bitter truth about to unravel. The mahogany desk seemed to gleam under the harsh fluorescent lights, reflecting the sweat beading on his forehead. He felt a tremor run through him, a physical manifestation of his internal collapse. This changes everything," Arthur managed, his voice a strained whisper, barely audible above the city's distant roar. He felt the carefully constructed facade of his life cracking, crumbling under the weight of this impending revelation. The opulent life, the planned wedding, the carefully cultivated image of success, all felt like fragile sandcastles threatened by a rising tide. Finch remained silent, his gaze unwavering, a silent observer of Arthur's implosion. The ticking clock, a relentless metronome, seemed to hammer each second into Arthur's consciousness, each tick a nail in the coffin of his carefully constructed world. He closed his eyes, picturing Isabella's face, pale and drawn, a stark contrast to the vibrant, ambitious woman waiting for him at the altar. The weight of his actions, his callous disregard, pressed down on him, suffocating. He opened his eyes, his vision blurry with unshed tears. The city lights outside, usually a symbol of his power and success, suddenly felt cold and distant, the vast indifference of the urban landscape echoing his own isolating despair. The truth, sharp and unforgiving, hung heavy in the air, a chilling prelude to the shattering of his world. Finch pushed the folder closer, the crisp paper a stark contrast to the tremor in Arthur's hand. He avoided its accusing whiteness, his gaze fixed on the polished mahogany. The scent of old leather, usually comforting, now felt suffocating, a thick, cloying perfume of impending doom. The implications, Finch's voice, a low, controlled rumble, cut through the silence, are significant, legally, socially, personally. Arthur swallowed, the lump in his throat thick as a stone. The city's relentless hum outside seemed to intensify, a mocking soundtrack to his crumbling world. He imagined Isabella's face, etched with the pain he'd inflicted, a stark counterpoint to the youthful glow of his fiancée. Guilt, sharp and sudden, pierced the numbness. He'd built his empire on indifference, but this was different. What happens now? He whispered, his voice barely audible above the city's relentless pulse. The prenuptial agreement is naturally void, Finch stated, his tone devoid of emotion, yet the words landed like blows. Your impending marriage, it's over. Arthur felt a strange detachment, as if observing himself from a distance. The opulent penthouse, the tailored suits, the carefully crafted image. They were props in a play he no longer understood. The weight of his actions pressed down, crushing him under the avalanche of his own making. He looked up, his eyes catching the glint of the city lights, once symbols of his power, now cold and accusing. The silence stretched, a chasm of self-loathing yawning before him. He closed his eyes, picturing Isabella's pale face, the fragility of her body a stark contrast to his own robust health. The irony was a bitter pill. He'd abandoned her, and now, the universe was revealing a truth far more devastating than any financial ruin. This wasn't about money. It was about kinship, a bond severed by his own callous actions. The cold dread seeped into his bones, chilling him to the core. He had betrayed not just a wife, but his own blood. The city lights seemed to dim, mirroring the darkness consuming him. The weight of his betrayal threatened to drown him, the silence amplifying the enormity of his mistake, the irretrievable damage inflicted. The truth, inescapable and unforgiving, cast a long shadow over his future, and a single, bitter tear traced a path down his cheek. The lawyer, Finch, a man whose face was as impassive as a granite statue, pushed the DNA results across the polished mahogany desk. The sterile scent of antiseptic from the nearby hospital hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the opulence of Arthur's penthouse. He avoided the document, his gaze fixed on the intricate grain of the wood, a familiar comfort now turned cold and alien. The city outside, usually a vibrant tapestry of light and sound, was a muffled roar, a chaotic symphony of his impending doom. The results are conclusive, Finch stated, his voice a low monotone that sliced through Arthur's carefully constructed calm. Isabella is your half-sister. The words hung in the air, suspended like shards of ice. Arthur felt a nauseating lurch in his stomach, a physical manifestation of the truth crashing down upon him. The carefully constructed facade, the years of calculated indifference, crumbled like sandcastles before a tidal wave. He remembered Isabella's laughter, her eyes sparkling with a mischievous glee that now seemed to mock him. He recalled the tenderness in her touch, the quiet strength that had sustained her through unimaginable pain. He had dismissed it all as he dismissed so much in his life, yet now it slammed back with the force of a runaway train. He cleared his throat, the sound raspy and strained. "There must be a mistake," he stammered, the words barely audible above the city's muted hum. The denial felt hollow even to him. The weight of his betrayal, previously a dull ache, intensified into a searing, unbearable pain. Finch remained stoic, unmoved by Arthur's desperate plea. The tests were conducted twice by separate labs. The results are irrefutable. He paused, his gaze unwavering. "This changes everything, Mr. Blackwood. Your impending marriage, it's not just legally void, it's morally reprehensible." The opulent penthouse, once a symbol of Arthur's success, felt like a gilded cage. The tailored suits, the bespoke furniture, the breathtaking view, it all seemed grotesquely inappropriate, a jarring juxtaposition to the overwhelming guilt that threatened to consume him. He felt the cold sweat beating on his forehead, the air thick with the scent of impending doom. His reflection in the polished mahogany showed a man ravaged, not by physical wounds, but by the shattering of his carefully crafted world. The city lights, once symbols of power and control, felt like cold, uncaring eyes judging him, accusing him. He had traded his sister's love for an empty illusion. The realization hit him with a brutal force, stripping away the last vestiges of his self-deception. The silence that followed was a heavy, suffocating blanket, punctuated only by the relentless beating of his own heart, a frantic drum solo against the backdrop of his impending ruin. The lawyer, Finch, remained impassive, his gaze unwavering. Arthur, throat dry, felt the mahogany desk grow cold beneath his elbows. The scent of polished wood, usually a comforting aroma, now reeked of his own hypocrisy. He'd built his life on this polished surface, a monument to his ambition, yet now it felt like a tombstone. Outside, the city's relentless pulse throbbed, a stark contrast to the suffocating silence in the room. The shimmering cityscape, usually a source of pride, felt like a judging audience, each twinkling light an accusatory eye. He ran a trembling hand through his hair, the silken strands feeling coarse and unfamiliar. The tailored suit, once a mark of power, now felt like a constricting straitjacket. "So," Finch's voice, calm and precise, sliced through the thick silence. "You understand the implications?" Arthur swallowed hard, the lump in his throat a physical manifestation of his mounting dread. He looked at the DNA report, the stark, clinical language a brutal condemnation. The words blurred, swimming before his eyes. Isabella, his sister. The thought clawed at his conscience, a relentless beast tearing at the fabric of his carefully constructed life. He remembered her smile, a radiant warmth that had once been a constant in his life, a warmth he'd carelessly extinguished. The memory stung, a searing burn against his soul. He'd chosen wealth, chosen ambition, chosen the glittering facade of success over the simple, profound bond of family. A wave of nausea washed over him. He gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles bone white, the polished surface cold and unforgiving beneath his trembling fingers. He closed his eyes, the image of Isabella's face, pale, weakened, but still beautiful, burned into the back of his eyelids. He had failed her. He had betrayed her. And now the crushing weight of that betrayal threatened to suffocate him. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny, to plead, but no sound emerged. The words choked in his throat, caught in the vice of guilt and despair. Finch's quiet presence, a silent observer of his unraveling, only amplified the deafening silence in the room. The city's throbbing pulse seemed to mock his despair, a relentless reminder of the life he had built on a foundation of lies and betrayal. The weight of his actions, the enormity of his mistake, pressed down upon him with unbearable force, threatening to crush him beneath its weight. He was alone, trapped in the opulent cage of his own making, facing the devastating truth of who he truly was. The sterile white of the doctor's office seemed to amplify the silence. Finch, the lawyer, stepped back, allowing Arthur to absorb the truth contained within the clinical document. The crisp, black lettering swam before Arthur's eyes, each word a hammer blow to his meticulously constructed reality. 50% match, Finch repeated, his voice a low murmur, a counterpoint to the frantic rhythm of Arthur's heart. The air thickened, heavy with the unspoken. Arthur felt a wave of nausea, the opulent furnishings of the office suddenly suffocating. The expensive Persian rug beneath his feet felt coarse, the polished mahogany desk, cold and unforgiving. He stared at the report, the stark numbers blurring, a grotesque mockery of his carefully planned future. Isabella, his sister. The words echoed in his mind, a cruel, ironic twist to a life built on calculated risks and ruthless ambition. He remembered her laughter, the bright, infectious sound that had once filled their opulent home, a sound he'd silenced with his callous indifference. Now, the image of her weakened form haunted him, a constant, agonizing reminder of his betrayal. The guilt was a physical entity, a weight pressing down on his chest, stealing his breath. This can't be right, he stammered, his voice barely a whisper, a pathetic attempt to deny the undeniable. His fingers trembled as he reached for a glass of water, the crystal cold against his clammy skin. Finch remained silent, his expression unreadable, a silent observer of Arthur's unraveling. The lawyer's impassivity was a stark contrast to the tempest raging within Arthur, a maelstrom of denial, guilt, and a dawning horror at the enormity of his actions. The city outside, a glittering panorama of lights, felt distant, unreal. His meticulously crafted world, built on ambition and self-interest, was crumbling before his eyes. The weight of his actions, the terrible truth of his betrayal, pressed down with crushing force, leaving him breathless, exposed, and utterly alone in the sterile silence of the doctor's office. The future he had so carefully planned was gone, replaced by an agonizing, inescapable reality. The DNA results hung in the air, a suffocating weight. Arthur stared at the report, the crisp white paper mocking his opulent surroundings. The scent of expensive leather from his briefcase suddenly felt cloying, the taste of his expensive scotch bitter on his tongue. He felt the cold seep into his bones, a chill far deeper than the air conditioning. Finch, ever the professional, remained silent, his gaze unwavering. Arthur's carefully constructed facade crumbled. He wanted to scream, to deny the truth clawing its way into his consciousness, but only a choked sob escaped. "It's impossible," he whispered, his voice raspy, betraying the tremor in his hands. He saw flashbacks, fleeting images. Isabella's laughter, their shared love of old films, a subtle resemblance he'd always dismissed as coincidence. Now, those memories were tainted, warped by the horrifying revelation of their shared blood. The guilt, previously a dull ache, became a searing brand. He had abandoned his sister, the only family he'd ever known, in her most vulnerable moment. Finch cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the suddenly vast room. "The results are conclusive, Mr. Blackwood," he said, his tone devoid of emotion, yet somehow more devastating than any outburst. "There is no doubt." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall, each tick a hammer blow to Arthur's already shattered composure. He felt trapped, a gilded cage of his own making, surrounded by the trappings of his wealth, yet utterly alone, drowning in the bitter tide of his self-inflicted pain. The future, once so bright, was now shrouded in a suffocating darkness, the weight of his betrayal pressing down, heavier than any burden he had ever known. The world tilted, and Arthur Blackwood, millionaire, found himself utterly and completely undone. The news hung heavy, a lead weight in Arthur's stomach. The opulent study, usually a sanctuary of comfort, felt like a suffocating tomb. He ran a trembling hand over the polished mahogany desk, the cool smoothness a stark contrast to the burning shame that consumed him. Finch, his lawyer, a man of few words and even fewer expressions, simply watched. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hall. each chime a hammer blow to Arthur's already shattered composure. I need a drink," Arthur rasped, his voice cracking. He didn't reach for the decanter of expensive scotch. The thought of it, once a source of comfort, now tasted like ash. Finch didn't offer a response, his impassive face betraying nothing. Arthur knew he wouldn't. Finch was a rock, a constant in Arthur's chaotic life, observing his descent with a quiet, almost clinical detachment. Yet, there was a hint of pity in his eyes, a flicker of something human that cracked Arthur's carefully constructed armor. He stumbled to the window, the city lights twinkling like distant stars, their beauty mocking his internal devastation. The glittering cityscape, a symbol of his success, now seemed grotesque, a testament to his shallowness, his callous disregard for the one person who truly mattered. He closed his eyes, a single tear escaping, tracing a path through the grime of his days. The memory of Isabella's laughter, her bright eyes full of life, flashed before him, a cruel juxtaposition to the reality of her current suffering. A shared memory, a love of old movies, the way they both preferred the same brand of tea. These weren't coincidences, were they? He opened his eyes, his reflection staring back, a haunted figure. His face etched with a guilt so profound it threatened to swallow him whole. He had discarded Isabella, thinking only of himself. Now the horrifying truth was unveiled. He had betrayed his own blood, the one person who should have been his closest confidant, his family. The weight of that betrayal was almost unbearable. "What do I do?" he whispered, the question lost in the vastness of his despair. The answer, he knew, wouldn't be easy. The path ahead was shrouded in darkness, but for the first time in a long time, Arthur felt a flicker of something else, a glimmer of the responsibility he'd so long evaded. The first step, however difficult, was to face the truth and the shattering consequences that followed. The sterile white of the doctor's office blurred at the edges. Arthur stared at the report, the stark black lettering a stark contrast to the nauseating swirl in his stomach. His carefully constructed world, built on ambition and callous indifference, was crumbling. He reread the words, each syllable a hammer blow. 99% probability of half-sibling relationship. Half-sister. Isabella. The woman he'd discarded like a worn-out garment was his blood. A choked sob escaped him, a sound so raw and unexpected it startled him. He felt a tremor run through him, a physical manifestation of the guilt that clawed at his insides. Finch, his lawyer, remained impassive, yet his eyes, usually hidden behind a carefully constructed mask of professionalism, held a flicker of something akin to pity. This can't be right," Arthur whispered, his voice hoarse. The words felt hollow even to his own ears. He desperately clutched at the edges of the report, as if he could somehow erase the truth it contained. Finch cleared his throat. "The results are conclusive, Mr. Hayes. There is no room for doubt." Arthur sank into the stiff leather chair, the coldness seeping into his bones. The opulent life he'd built, the champagne wishes and caviar dreams, felt meaningless, tainted by this horrifying revelation. He thought of Isabella's frail form, her haunted eyes, the resilience she'd shown despite his cruelty. He had condemned her to this suffering, and she was his own blood. "My God!" he breathed, the words barely audible. He squeezed his eyes shut, the image of Isabella's face, etched with pain and disappointment, searing itself onto his mind. The scent of her favorite lilac perfume, a faint memory, clung to him, a poignant reminder of a connection he'd so carelessly severed. The weight of his actions crushed him, a suffocating blanket of regret. His impending marriage, once a symbol of triumph, now felt like a grotesque mockery. He had traded loyalty for fleeting pleasure, family for ambition, and the price was far greater than he could have ever imagined. The bitter taste of betrayal was a horrifying new reality. The mahogany desk felt cold against Arthur's trembling hands. He pushed the DNA report away, the crisp white paper a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within him. The air in Finch's opulent office, usually redolent with the scent of expensive leather and old money, now felt suffocating. He could taste the metallic tang of fear on his tongue. "There has to be a mistake," he croaked, his voice raspy. The words felt inadequate, pathetic even, against the enormity of the revelation. Finch, his usually unflappable lawyer, merely steepled his fingers, his gaze unwavering. "The lab is impeccable, Mr. Hayes. The results are definitive." The lawyer's quiet certainty was more damning than any shouting match. Arthur's mind raced. He saw Isabella's face, her pale skin, the way the sunlight used to catch the gold in her hair, the vibrant smile that had vanished long ago. He remembered the way her laughter used to fill their sprawling mansion, a sound now replaced by the ghosts of his own callous decisions. He traded her for a younger model, a trophy wife. Now, he realized the trophy was tarnished irrevocably so. He slammed his fist on the desk, the sound echoing in the silent room. But it's impossible," he stammered, the denial a desperate grasp at sanity. "It can't be true. She's everything I'm not." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. He saw fleeting glimpses of Isabella's resilience, her quiet strength in the face of adversity. He dismissed it as stubbornness. Now he saw it as a reflection of his own hidden nature. Finch sighed, a sound that held a weary understanding. The tests also revealed a shared genetic marker, a rare anomaly. "It's the smoking gun, Mr. Hayes." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "Your upcoming marriage? It's complicated." The weight of his actions pressed down on Arthur, crushing him beneath the rubble of his carefully constructed lies. The champagne wishes, the caviar dreams, were now nothing but bitter ashes in his mouth. He had destroyed his only family, and the realization was a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left him gasping for air. The gilded cage of his wealth felt suddenly claustrophobic, a prison of his own making. He wasn't just facing legal ramifications. He was confronting the moral bankruptcy of his existence. His reflection in the polished mahogany gleamed, a stranger staring back at him, a man stripped bare of his illusions. The opulent penthouse suite felt like a mausoleum. Arthur paced, the plush carpet muffling the frantic rhythm of his steps. The champagne he'd poured earlier sat untouched, the bubbles now gone flat, mirroring his own deflating hope. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, ruffling it into disarray, a physical manifestation of his inner chaos. The lawyer's words echoed in his ears. "Your upcoming marriage? It's complicated." Complicated was an understatement. It was a catastrophic implosion, a meticulously built castle reduced to rubble. He sank onto the chaise lounge, the silk cool against his skin, offering no solace. He stared at the city sprawling beneath him, a glittering tapestry of lights that mocked his internal darkness. He replayed the lawyer's words, searching for a loophole, a sliver of hope that this nightmarish revelation was a cruel joke. But Finch's expression, the unwavering certainty in his eyes, offered no such comfort. He thought of Isabella, her face, a ghost haunting the periphery of his mind. He remembered their shared childhood photographs, a faded, dusty box stored away in the attic of his memories. There were smiles, there were moments of shared laughter and joy, almost precognitive in their mirroring of his own life. He dismissed them as coincidences, random similarities. But now, the eerie likeness of their expressions, the matching tilt of their eyes, were impossible to ignore, impossible to deny. The truth felt like a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, stealing the air from his lungs. He picked up the phone, his hand shaking. He dialed Veronica's number, his fiancée, the woman who embodied everything Isabella was not. Her sharp, ambitious spirit, her youthful energy, had been a stark contrast to Isabella's quiet strength, which he'd once mistaken for weakness. But now, looking back, he couldn't help but see it as the stoicism of someone burdened with a secret he had never known. He knew what he had to do, and the cold dread of that knowledge seeped into his very being. The call went straight to voicemail. He left no message. The silence that followed was deafening, a testament to the crumbling facade of his perfect life. The stale air of the lawyer's office hung heavy, thick with the unspoken. Arthur stared at the DNA report, the stark black lettering blurring through his unshed tears. He felt a nauseous lurch in his stomach, a physical manifestation of the shattering truth. This can't be right, he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. Finch, the lawyer, remained impassive, his steely gaze unwavering. The mahogany desk between them felt like a chasm, separating Arthur from any semblance of normalcy. He tried to focus on the legal jargon, searching for a loophole, a technicality, anything to escape the monstrous implications. But the words swam before his eyes, meaningless scribbles against the backdrop of his collapsing world. The opulent lifestyle he'd built, the carefully constructed image, the impending marriage, all crumbling like a poorly made sandcastle. A sudden, sharp memory pierced the fog. Isabella's laughter, echoing in the cavernous space of their childhood home. A home he had since forgotten, a life he had erased. He remembered her eyes, the same striking hazel as his own. The similarities, dismissed as coincidences then, screamed at him now, a chilling chorus of undeniable truth. A shared love for old movies, a peculiar habit of twirling a lock of hair when nervous, details so insignificant then, so damning now. There must be a mistake, he pleaded, the desperation clawing at his throat. Finch's silence was a heavy weight, pressing down on him. The scent of old leather and polished wood became suffocating, a physical representation of his confinement. He felt trapped, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him, burying him under the weight of his own deceit. The champagne, once a symbol of celebration, now felt like a bitter mockery of his impending doom. Outside, the city lights twinkled, oblivious to his inner turmoil. He was alone, drowning in the bitter realization of his profound betrayal, a betrayal not just of a wife, but of his blood, his only family. The lawyer's office, usually a sanctuary of legal formality, felt like a suffocating tomb. The scent of old leather and polished wood, normally comforting, now felt acrid, mirroring the bitterness churning in Arthur's gut. He ran a trembling hand through his hair, the expensive gel slick and unnerving against his skin. He stared at the DNA report, the stark black lettering a cruel mockery of his carefully constructed life. This isn't possible, he croaked, his voice barely audible above the frantic rhythm of his own heart. Finch, the lawyer, remained impassive, a granite statue observing Arthur's slow unraveling. The silence stretched, taut and agonizing, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of an antique clock. Each tick felt like a hammer blow, driving another nail into the coffin of Arthur's self-deception. The results are conclusive, Mr. Sterling, Finch finally said, his voice low and devoid of sympathy. There is a 99% probability that Isabella was your half-sister. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Arthur felt a wave of nausea, a visceral reaction to the shattering truth. He slumped back in his chair, the expensive leather suddenly cold and unforgiving. He closed his eyes, images flashing behind his lids. Isabella's laughter, the warmth of her hand in his, the shared love for old movies, the identical hazel eyes he had dismissed as mere coincidence. Now they screamed their kinship. The truth was a brutal, inescapable reality. He opened his eyes, a desperate plea forming on his lips. There has to be a mistake, clerical error, anything. His voice cracked, revealing the vulnerability he had so carefully concealed for years. The carefully constructed facade, the arrogance, the callous disregard for others, all crumbled before the weight of this undeniable truth. He was not just abandoning a wife. He was betraying his blood, the only family he ever had. The champagne, the luxury cars, the sprawling mansion. They all felt hollow, meaningless trinkets against the backdrop of his monumental betrayal. The city lights outside, once a symbol of his success, now mocked his profound failure. He was drowning in the icy waters of his own making. The weight of his guilt was crushing, suffocating. The stale air in the lawyer's office clung to Arthur like a shroud. He felt the scratch of the cheap paper napkin he'd crumpled in his hand, the rough texture a stark contrast to the silk lining of his suit. Outside, the city hummed, a relentless symphony of indifference to his inner turmoil. Finch, impassive as ever, watched him, his silence more condemning than any words. Arthur's mind raced, a chaotic whirlwind of denial and dawning horror. The shared love of old films, a detail he dismissed as insignificant, now echoed like a deafening accusation. Isabella's laugh, once a grating annoyance, was now a haunting melody, carrying the painful echo of his unforgivable actions. He saw her face, pale and drawn, framed by the sterile white hospital sheets, a stark contrast to the vibrant woman he'd once known, a woman now cruelly stolen from him by circumstance and his own heartless choices. It can't be true, he whispered, his voice a fragile thread against the suffocating silence. The taste of bile rose in his throat, acrid and bitter. He gripped the arms of the chair, his knuckles bone-white. Finch leaned forward, the faint scent of his expensive cologne a jarring intrusion on Arthur's misery. The test is irrefutable, Mr. Sterling. The implications are significant. The word significant felt like a euphemism, a hollow substitute for the devastating truth that was tearing him apart. The weight of his actions, the profound betrayal, pressed down on him with crushing force. He traded familial love for fleeting gratification, for the hollow pursuit of youth and beauty, and the price was far greater than he'd ever imagined. His carefully constructed world had imploded, leaving behind only the rubble of his own selfish desires. He'd abandoned not just a wife, but his sister, his only blood relative, in her time of greatest need. The realization was a physical blow, a gut-wrenching pain that overshadowed the sharp sting of guilt. He had to understand, he had to make sense of this brutal twist of fate. But where to begin? How could he ever hope to repair the damage he'd inflicted? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, as heavy as the guilt that threatened to consume him. The lawyer's office, a sterile box of polished mahogany and muted grays, felt like a tomb. Arthur stared at the DNA report, the stark black lettering blurring through a film of unshed tears. The crisp scent of Finch's cologne, usually a symbol of success, now mocked him. He felt the cold press of the chair against his spine, a physical manifestation of his isolation. His opulent life, once a source of pride, now felt like a gilded cage. The results are conclusive, Mr. Sterling, Finch repeated, his voice a low drone that cut through Arthur's stunned silence. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. Arthur's throat constricted, a physical manifestation of his rising panic. He could feel the blood drain from his face, leaving him pale and weak. He swallowed, the lump in his throat refusing to budge. But, Isabella, he stammered, the name catching in his throat like a sob. The memory of her face, etched with pain, flashed before his eyes. The carefree laughter, the shared love of old movies, the unexpected kinship. It all now felt tainted, twisted into a grotesque parody of familial love. Finch remained silent, his gaze unwavering. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Each tick was a hammer blow to Arthur's already shattered composure. The weight of his betrayal pressed down on him, a crushing burden of guilt and self-loathing. He pushed himself away from the desk, the polished wood cold beneath his trembling hands. He paced the room, his footsteps echoing in the unnerving quiet, the rhythmic sound mirroring the frantic beat of his heart. The city's hum, previously a background noise, now roared in his ears, a symphony of his own self-inflicted torment. He imagined Isabella, alone, struggling, and the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't just abandoned his wife, he had abandoned his sister, his only family. The sharp scent of antiseptic, a phantom smell from Isabella's hospital room, washed over him, triggering a wave of nausea. He closed his eyes, the image of her pale face, her weakened body, seared into his mind. The cold realization settled, a heavy stone in his gut. His carefully constructed world, based on lies and self-deception, had crumbled. He was left with the wreckage of his own making, the ruins of his selfish desires, and the crushing weight of an unthinkable truth. He had betrayed the only blood relative he had ever known. The tears finally came, hot and uncontrolled, a torrent of remorse that washed over him, leaving him trembling and broken. The lawyer, Finch, offered a tissue, the crisp white a stark contrast to the wreckage of Arthur's composure. He didn't take it. The mahogany desk felt slick with sweat. I need a moment," he choked, his voice raw. Finch nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the devastation. The grandfather clock ticked, each chime a hammer blow to Arthur's already fractured psyche. He left the sterile office, the city's cacophony a jarring counterpoint to the quiet turmoil within. The air, thick with the exhaust fumes of 1,000 cars, stung his nostrils, a physical reminder of his suffocating reality. He hailed a cab, the plush leather a jarring contrast to the harshness of his thoughts. The city blurred through the rain-streaked window, a dizzying kaleidoscope of lights and shadows reflecting the chaos within him. He arrived at his penthouse, the opulent space mocking his inner desolation. The view, usually a source of pride, was now just a vast expanse of indifference. He sank onto the plush sofa, the soft cushions offering no comfort. His reflection in the polished glass coffee table stared back, a stranger, gaunt and haunted. He saw the cold calculation in his own eyes, the same eyes that had once looked upon Isabella with such callous disregard. The guilt was a physical weight, a crushing burden on his chest. He thought of Isabella's frail body, the vibrant spirit now dimmed by pain and abandonment. He remembered her laughter, the soft curve of her smile, the way her eyes sparkled when they watched old movies together. Now, those memories were tainted, poisoned by the sickening realization of his betrayal. He hadn't just abandoned his wife. He had shattered the only familial connection he had ever known. He picked up a framed photograph, a picture of them on their wedding day, their happiness a cruel mockery of his current despair. Isabella's radiant smile, once a symbol of their love, now seemed like a ghost, a reminder of his profound failure. He traced her features with a trembling finger, his heart constricting with a pain so deep it stole his breath. He hadn't just broken a marriage. He had fractured a soul, a bond far deeper than he had ever imagined. The truth was a bitter pill, a stark revelation that left him stripped bare, vulnerable, and utterly alone in the gilded cage of his own creation. The tears finally came, a torrent of remorse that washed over him, leaving him broken and utterly bereft. His world, once meticulously constructed, lay in ruins. The rain hammered against the penthouse windows, mirroring the storm raging inside Arthur. He stared at the DNA report, the stark black lettering a cruel mockery of his carefully constructed life. Revulsion warred with a nascent, terrifying understanding. Isabella, the woman he'd discarded like a worn-out garment, was his half-sister. The words echoed in his mind, a grotesque symphony of guilt and horror. The opulent apartment, usually a sanctuary of comfort, felt like a suffocating prison. The plush carpet beneath his bare feet seemed to absorb his despair. He sank onto the sofa, the expensive silk cool against his burning skin. The city lights blurred through his tears, a kaleidoscope of pain. He clenched his fists, his knuckles bone white. The image of Isabella's weakened frame, her once vibrant eyes dulled by suffering, flashed before him. The memory of her laughter, once a source of joy, now felt like a cruel taunt. He had not only abandoned his wife, he had betrayed his only blood relative. A low groan escaped his lips, a sound born of profound agony. He ran a hand through his hair, the once meticulously styled strands now disheveled and wild. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a crushing burden he couldn't escape. He felt the cold grip of isolation, a stark contrast to the superficial relationships that had once defined his life. He had traded familial love for fleeting pleasure, and now the price was far greater than he could have ever imagined. The guilt gnawed at him, a relentless, insidious beast feeding on his remorse. He whispered her name, Isabella, the sound barely audible above the relentless drumming of the rain. The word tasted like ash in his mouth, a bitter reminder of his profound failure. He had built his life on lies, on a foundation of self-serving ambition and callous disregard for others. The truth, brutal and unforgiving, had ripped away the facade, revealing the emptiness at his core. He was not just a heartless millionaire. He was a betrayer, a man who had abandoned the only family he had ever known. The realization was a searing brand, a mark of shame that would forever stain his soul. The city lights outside seemed to mock his misery, their glittering indifference a stark contrast to his own profound despair. The news shattered her perfectly manicured world. Serafina, with her diamond-encrusted smile and designer handbag, stared at Arthur, her face slowly draining of color. The expensive champagne flute slipped from her grasp, the crystal shattering on the polished marble floor, a sound oddly mirroring the explosion of her carefully constructed future. You mean he's your sister?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. The opulent room, once a symbol of their impending happiness, now felt suffocating, claustrophobic. Arthur flinched, unable to meet her gaze. The guilt was a physical weight, crushing him beneath its unbearable pressure. He'd promised her a life of luxury, a fairy tale ending. Now he had nothing but ashes and a lifetime of regret. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, filled only with the sound of Serafina's shallow, ragged breaths. How could you?" she finally managed, her voice laced with a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. The carefully maintained facade of composure crumbled, revealing the raw pain beneath. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the already distorted image of the man she thought she knew. The diamonds on her ring glittered mockingly in the harsh light, reflecting her devastation. He watched, helpless, as the meticulously constructed image of his perfect fiancée dissolved. The hurt in her eyes was a reflection of his own self-loathing. He had not only betrayed Isabella, but also this woman, who had believed in his lies, in his carefully cultivated persona. He deserved every bit of the pain he was now experiencing. The weight of his deceit was almost too much to bear. He knew in that moment that some wounds were too deep to ever truly heal. The future he had envisioned, a gilded cage of wealth and status, lay in ruins around him, a testament to his own heartless ambition. The lawyer, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the weariness of witnessing human folly, cleared his throat. The mahogany desk between them felt like a chasm, separating Arthur from the wreckage of his life. The air hung thick with the unspoken, the scent of expensive leather mingling with the metallic tang of Arthur's fear. He stared at the crisp, official-looking document, the stark black lettering blurring through a haze of disbelief. "The results are conclusive, Mr. Hayes," the lawyer stated, his voice devoid of sympathy. The words echoed in the opulent study, each syllable a hammer blow against Arthur's carefully constructed world. Outside, the city hummed with oblivious energy, a stark contrast to the seismic shift occurring within him. Arthur swallowed, the lump in his throat refusing to budge. He ran a trembling hand through his perfectly styled hair, the gesture betraying the turmoil within. It's impossible," he finally managed, his voice a strained whisper. The words sounded hollow even to his own ears. The lawyer remained impassive, his gaze unwavering. "The DNA evidence is irrefutable. Isabella is your half-sister." The revelation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Arthur felt a cold dread creep up his spine, a chilling realization that replaced his initial denial with a paralyzing sense of horror. He had abandoned, betrayed his own blood. The opulent surroundings, once a source of pride and comfort, now felt like a gilded cage, trapping him in the suffocating grip of his own guilt. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked relentlessly, each tick a morbid reminder of time inexorably marching forward, carrying him further away from the possibility of redemption. The weight of his actions crashed down on him, the full force of his betrayal finally dawning upon him with crushing weight. His carefully constructed world began to crumble, brick by brick, until only a cold, terrifying void remained. He saw the images of Isabella, not as a former wife but as a sister, a kindred spirit he had discarded in her moment of greatest need, and that realization was more excruciating than any physical pain. He closed his eyes, the image of her pale face, etched with pain and disillusionment, a searing brand on his consciousness. The news hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Arthur stared at the polished mahogany of his desk, the grain a dizzying swirl beneath his trembling fingers. He felt the cool, smooth surface against his skin, a stark contrast to the burning shame that consumed him. His fiancée, Serafina, sat rigidly on the plush velvet chaise lounge, her perfectly sculpted face a mask of stunned disbelief. The scent of her expensive perfume, usually intoxicating, now felt cloying, a suffocating sweetness in the suddenly stale air. This can't be right," Arthur stammered, his voice a fragile whisper. The words felt inadequate, hollow echoes in the vast emptiness of his soul. He glanced at Serafina, her flawless composure cracking, revealing a flicker of fear beneath the surface. The carefully constructed facade of their relationship, built on ambition and mutual advantage, crumbled before the brutal reality of his past. Serafina's silence was more deafening than any outburst. Her eyes, usually sparkling with ambition and excitement, were now dull, reflecting the shattering of her carefully curated dreams. He saw a subtle tremor in her perfectly manicured hand, a betrayal of her composure. "Arthur," she finally spoke, her voice barely a breath. "Explain this." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and cold. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was the chilling realization that she had invested her future in a man who was, fundamentally, a stranger. A stranger with a dark and devastating secret. Arthur opened his mouth to speak, to offer some feeble explanation, some desperate attempt at self-justification. But no words came. The weight of his betrayal, the crushing revelation of his incestuous relationship with Isabella, rendered him speechless. The opulent study, once a sanctuary of his success, now felt like a tomb, encasing him in the suffocating weight of his own guilt. He saw his life, his carefully constructed world, reduced to rubble, a testament to his callous indifference and selfish ambition. The city lights, visible through the expansive windows, seemed to mock his misery, their cheerful glow a stark contrast to the darkness that had engulfed him. He had gambled everything and lost it all. And the most painful loss, the one that cut him to his core, was the sister he had carelessly discarded. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. Serafina's composure, meticulously crafted over years of social climbing, finally shattered. Tears welled, blurring the sharp lines of her perfectly applied makeup. The expensive perfume clinging to the air now felt acrid, a bitter reminder of the gilded cage she'd envisioned sharing with Arthur. "So," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you abandoned your sister." The word hung between them, heavy with accusation and a chilling undercurrent of disbelief. Arthur flinched, the mahogany desk no longer a comforting presence, but a cold, hard barrier between him and the truth he couldn't escape. He saw the flicker of revulsion in her eyes, a stark contrast to the avarice he'd once perceived. The ambition that had once drawn them together now seemed pathetically shallow, a flimsy foundation for a life built on a lie. His carefully constructed world was crumbling, and the debris was sharp and unforgiving. He opened his mouth to speak, to plead, to explain the tangled web of denial and self-preservation that had driven him, but the words caught in his throat. The image of Isabella, frail yet strong, haunted him. Her quiet suffering, once a distant inconvenience, now resonated with a brutal clarity. He discarded her like an old garment. Yet she was his blood, his reflection. The city lights outside, once symbols of his success, now seemed to mock his fall. He was alone, stripped bare, the opulent surroundings a cruel reminder of the emptiness he had cultivated. The weight of his betrayal pressed down, heavier than any financial burden he'd ever faced. He was not just a heartless millionaire, but a heartless brother, a heartless man. Serafina rose, her movements stiff, precise, devoid of the usual practiced grace. The air crackled with unspoken words, with the sharp, clean break of a relationship forged in deceit. She turned, her back rigid, her silhouette sharp against the city lights. The click of her heels on the polished floor echoed the finality of her departure, leaving Arthur alone in the ruins of his carefully constructed world. The silence that followed was complete, absolute, and utterly devastating. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and lilies, a stark contrast to the opulent fragrances Arthur was accustomed to. Isabella lay in bed, her face pale but resolute, her eyes, usually bright with mischief, now shadowed with a weariness that cut Arthur to the core. He stood awkwardly by the window, the cityscape a blurred canvas of light and shadow, mirroring the turmoil within him. The silence was a heavy blanket, stifling and suffocating. He cleared his throat, the sound brittle and uncertain. "Isabella, I need to talk to you." She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on something beyond the window, somewhere far away from the sterile reality of her room. The sunlight caught the silver streaks in her hair, a poignant reminder of the years stolen by his selfishness. He saw the subtle tremor in her hand, a nervous twitch he vaguely remembered from their childhood. He swallowed, the lump in his throat constricting his breath. "About the test results. I know what I did was unforgivable." He winced at the inadequacy of the words, the vast chasm they failed to bridge. Finally, she turned her head, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that both terrified and mesmerized him. The sadness in them was profound, a bottomless well of sorrow he had carelessly plunged her into. "Unforgivable is a small word for abandoning your sister when she needed you most," she whispered, her voice a fragile echo in the quiet room. The sharpness in her tone was a cold slap to his already bruised ego. He approached the bed cautiously, the polished floorboards seeming to creak with the weight of his guilt. I never knew you were my sister." The words were a desperate plea for understanding, a pathetic attempt to lessen the weight of his transgression. A bitter laugh escaped her lips, short and dry, like crackling leaves in autumn. "Knowing wouldn't have changed a thing, would it? You abandoned me, Arthur. You left me to wither and die, and your money couldn't buy back the life you stole." Her words were laced with an icy venom that pierced through his carefully constructed defenses. The tears that finally streamed down her face were not tears of grief alone, but of profound betrayal and disillusionment. The lilies by the bed, once a symbol of hopeful healing, now seemed to wilt under the weight of her unspoken pain. Arthur could only stand there, the city lights outside blurring into a meaningless spectacle of wealth and indifference. His wealth meant nothing. His apologies seemed hollow and insufficient. He had a long way to go before any semblance of redemption. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the rhythmic beeping of Isabella's heart monitor. Arthur shifted his weight, the polished hospital floor cold beneath his expensive shoes. He longed to reach out, to touch her hand, but the fear of rejection held him back. The lilies, their fragrance cloying in the sterile air, seemed to mock his opulent lifestyle. He had showered her with gifts before, but now they felt like worthless trinkets against the backdrop of his betrayal. "Isabella," he began again, his voice barely a whisper, I want to understand." He watched her face, searching for a flicker of forgiveness, a crack in the icy wall she'd erected around her heart. Her eyes, usually sparkling with intelligence, were dull with pain, mirroring the gray November sky outside. He continued, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I never truly knew, the extent of my actions. I was so consumed by By my own selfish desires, I didn't see. He trailed off, the enormity of his guilt overwhelming him. The scent of antiseptic mingled with the faint, lingering perfume she usually wore, a sharp, floral scent that once had been a source of attraction, now a haunting reminder of what he'd lost. A single tear escaped Isabella's eye, tracing a slow path through the faint dusting of powder on her cheek. He wanted to wipe it away, but restrained himself. He had earned this distance, this coldness. He had to earn her trust back, painstakingly, one agonizing step at a time. "Understanding doesn't change the past, Arthur," she finally said, her voice low and trembling. Her gaze shifted to the window, the city lights twinkling like distant stars, a stark contrast to the bleakness of her reality. "It doesn't erase the pain, the loneliness, the feeling of utter abandonment." Her words were sharp, precise, each syllable a tiny dagger piercing his heart. The weight of his actions, the full measure of his cruelty, pressed down on him, crushing him under its burden. This wasn't about money. It was about the irreparable damage he had inflicted on the only blood relative he had ever known. He knew then, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his journey towards redemption was just beginning, a long and arduous path fraught with challenges and uncertainties. But he had to start somewhere, and this small, sterile hospital room, under the cold November light, was where his journey would begin. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Arthur like a second skin. He watched Isabella, her face pale and drawn against the crisp white pillows. The November sunlight, weak and watery, filtered through the hospital window, casting long shadows across the room. He shifted uncomfortably in the plastic chair, the hard edges digging into his expensive suit. He'd bought her lilies, a gesture he now recognized as pathetically inadequate. I came to apologize," he began, his voice rough, unfamiliar even to his own ears. The words felt clumsy, inadequate to express the crushing weight of his guilt. Isabella didn't meet his gaze. Her eyes, usually bright and full of life, were clouded with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. A single tear tracked a slow path down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail. "Apologies are cheap, Arthur," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the hospital machinery, "especially when they're delivered so late." Her voice was laced with frost, a chilling reminder of the chasm that separated them. He winced, the pain sharp and visceral. He reached out, his hand hovering hesitantly above hers. She didn't pull away, but neither did she encourage his touch. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken accusations and years of regret. He spoke again, choosing his words carefully, trying to navigate the treacherous terrain of their fractured relationship. "I want to understand what happened, Isabella. I want to understand why I acted the way I did. He faltered, unable to articulate the depth of his selfishness. A faint smile, tinged with bitterness, touched her lips. "You were afraid, weren't you? Afraid of the responsibility, the commitment, the inconvenience." Her voice was stronger now, filled with a quiet strength that surprised him. He nodded, shame burning in his cheeks. He had been afraid of the change, the disruption to his carefully curated life. He'd built his empire on a foundation of callousness, and Isabella's accident had threatened to shatter it. Now, the truth was far more devastating than the collapse of his carefully constructed world. The truth was that he'd abandoned his own sister. The weight of that realization was almost unbearable. He was not only a heartless husband, but a heartless brother. The lilies in the vase seemed to wilt before his eyes, mirroring the withering of his own soul. He knew this was just the beginning of a long, arduous road to redemption. A road paved with regret, sorrow, and the possibility, however slim, of forgiveness. The hospital room felt cold, despite the central heating humming softly. Arthur fidgeted, the stiff fabric of his suit a stark contrast to the worn, floral pattern of Isabella's hospital gown. He'd brought her sunflowers, a clumsy attempt at brightness in this sterile environment. Their scent, usually so vibrant, felt muted, almost apologetic. He cleared his throat, the sound brittle and inadequate. "Isabella, he began, his voice a low rumble. I need to talk to you. Isabella's gaze remained fixed on the window, her reflection a pale ghost in the glass. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken resentments. The only sound was the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor, a constant reminder of her fragility. Finally, she spoke, her voice thin and reedy, barely a whisper. There's nothing left to say, Arthur. You said everything you needed to when you left. Her words were sharp, each syllable a tiny shard of ice. Arthur winced. He knew he deserved her anger, her coldness. He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant, unsure. She didn't pull away, but there was no warmth in her response, just the passive acceptance of his presence. I understand you're angry, he said, his voice cracking slightly. But this isn't just about the past, about what I did. He paused, struggling to find the right words. It's about us, about who we are to each other. The words felt clumsy, inadequate, but they were the truth. He swallowed hard, the dryness in his throat a physical manifestation of his anxiety. Isabella finally turned her gaze to him. Her eyes, the same shade of startling blue as his, filled with a mixture of pain and weary resignation. The room fell silent again, the weight of their shared history pressing down on them. The sunflowers in the vase seemed to droop slightly, mirroring the heavy burden in the room. The realization of their blood tie, of the family bond he'd so casually disregarded, pressed in on Arthur with a fresh wave of gut-wrenching guilt. This wasn't just about a failed marriage. It was about a betrayal of the deepest kind. And the road to forgiveness, he knew, would be long and arduous indeed. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to the air, a stark contrast to the vibrant sunflowers Arthur had brought. He watched Isabella, her reflection a pale ghost in the window pane, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor a relentless undercurrent to the silence. He'd expected anger, a torrent of accusations. Instead, there was this stillness, a frozen landscape of grief. Isabella, he began again, his voice a low tremor. I know I hurt you, more than words can say. He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant, but she didn't flinch. Her skin, once vibrant, was now pale and fragile, the veins a delicate roadmap beneath the surface. She finally turned, her eyes, the same startling blue as his, mirroring his own turmoil, though hers held a chilling depth of sorrow. You destroyed my life, Arthur, she whispered, the words barely audible above the rhythmic beep. You took everything. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, suffocating. He'd rationalized his desertion, shielded himself behind a wall of self-preservation, but the truth was raw and brutal now. This wasn't just a broken marriage. It was a fractured blood tie, a betrayal of the deepest order. I know, he choked out, the words catching in his throat. And I can't undo it. But I need you to understand. He hesitated, searching for a way to bridge the chasm between them, to explain the agonizing realization that the woman he'd abandoned was his own flesh and blood. The sunflowers seemed to droop further, wilting under the weight of unspoken remorse. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, punctuated only by the steady, mechanical beat of the heart monitor, counting down the seconds of their agonizing standoff. The smell of antiseptic sharpened, a bitter reminder of the cold reality of their situation. The fragile hope of reconciliation felt as brittle as the dry petals of the sunflowers, threatened by the harsh winds of betrayal and regret. The sterile white of the hospital room seemed to amplify the silence, a suffocating blanket draped over Arthur's guilt. Isabella's gaze, fixed on the window, held a glacial coldness that pierced through him. The sunflowers, vibrant against the stark backdrop, seemed to mock his pathetic attempt at reconciliation. He shifted uncomfortably, the stiff hospital chair offering no comfort. Isabella, he began again, his voice barely a whisper, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the room. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was a relentless percussion, hammering at his already fragile composure. He reached for her hand again, his touch hesitant, tentative. This time she didn't pull away. Her skin, cool beneath his touch, felt almost ethereal. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps a glimmer of recognition, of the shared blood that bound them, despite the chasm of his betrayal. I didn't know, he stammered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. I never knew you were my sister. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail in its wake. Knowing wouldn't have changed anything, Arthur, she said, her voice raspy, each word a painful extraction. You abandoned me. You left me to wither away. The weight of her words crashed down on him, heavier than any physical burden he'd ever known. The scent of antiseptic mingled with the faint perfume he remembered from their marriage. A jarring juxtaposition of sterile reality and bittersweet memory. He looked at the sunflowers, their vibrant yellow now dulling, mirroring the dimming hope in his own heart. He had to try. He had to show her the truth of his remorse, not with words, but with actions. He had to begin to atone for the devastation he'd wrought. The silence lingered, heavy and pregnant with unspoken grief and regret. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor continued its relentless count, a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the irreplaceable damage he'd inflicted. He squeezed her hand gently, offering a silent apology that words couldn't express. The journey to reconciliation felt impossibly long, fraught with obstacles, but he knew he had to start somewhere. He had to start now. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the vibrant sunflowers Arthur had brought, a feeble offering of peace. Isabella's silence was a wall, impenetrable and cold. He watched her, her face etched with a weariness that went beyond physical pain. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, casting long shadows across the room, highlighting the stark lines of her grief. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the quiet room. Isabella, He fumbled for words, the familiar eloquence he commanded in boardrooms failing him utterly. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, stealing his breath. Isabella's gaze remained fixed on the distant cityscape. Her fingers, gnarled and thin, traced the edge of a worn photograph resting on her bedside table. A picture of a younger, happier Isabella, before the accident, before the abandonment, before the shattering truth. Don't, she whispered, her voice frail but resolute. Don't try to explain. There's nothing you can say. The words hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving. He saw the flicker of a tear, a single silent tear that tracked a path down her cheek. Arthur reached for her hand again, his touch hesitant, almost apologetic. This time she didn't flinch. Her skin, cool and fragile beneath his touch, spoke volumes of her suffering. He felt a surge of raw, agonizing remorse. This wasn't just a woman he'd wronged. It was his sister, his blood. The realization hammered at him with brutal force. He squeezed her hand, a silent plea for understanding. The sunflowers, symbols of his remorse, seemed to wilt under the weight of his guilt. The rhythmic beep of her heart monitor punctuated the silence, a constant reminder of her fragility, a testament to the life he'd nearly destroyed. The afternoon light faded, casting long shadows that mirrored the darkness that still lingered between them. The path to forgiveness, he knew, would be long and arduous. But he had to begin. He had to start walking. The sterile hospital room felt smaller, suffocating under the weight of unspoken words. Isabella's gaze, fixed on a faded photograph of a smiling child, a child who looked remarkably like Arthur, held a chilling stillness. The sunflowers, wilting slightly, mirrored the slow decay of their relationship. The air hung heavy with the scent of antiseptic and unspoken grief. Arthur shifted uncomfortably, the plush armchair offering little comfort. He'd rehearsed 1,000 apologies, each one falling flat against the reality of his actions. Isabella, he began, his voice a low rumble. I understand if you can't forgive me, but I need you to understand. He paused, searching for the right words, the words that could bridge the chasm of pain he'd created. Understand what, Arthur? Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried the sharp sting of years of hurt. The faintest tremor in her hand betrayed the effort it took to maintain her composure. Sunlight caught the single tear tracing a path through the wrinkles etched around her eyes. It was a tear that spoke volumes. He swallowed, the lump in his throat tightening. I understand that my actions were unforgivable, that I betrayed you, betrayed us. I never knew. I never could have imagined. His voice cracked, the carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of his guilt. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, perhaps recognition, maybe a sliver of the shared history they'd been denied. He continued, his voice raw with emotion. Losing you, abandoning you, it wasn't just losing a wife. It was losing my sister, the sister I never knew I had, the sister I hurt beyond repair. The thought, it's a constant, agonizing torment. He reached for her hand again, his touch gentler this time, hesitant but heartfelt. She didn't pull away. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken emotions. A silence broken only by the steady rhythm of the heart monitor, a relentless reminder of her fragility, a testament to the life he'd so carelessly endangered. The afternoon light faded, casting long shadows across the room, shadows that seemed to mirror the darkness still lingering between them. The path to forgiveness remained arduous, but for the first time, Arthur saw a glimmer of hope, a tiny spark in Isabella's eyes that hinted at the possibility of healing. The long road to redemption had begun. The faded photographs lay scattered on the worn wooden table, a testament to a life stolen, a childhood fractured. One showed a giggling toddler with bright, curious eyes, clutching a ragged teddy bear. Another, a slightly older child, beaming with pride beside a meticulously crafted birdhouse. Isabella traced the lines of the younger child's face, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. The resemblance to Arthur was undeniable. They found me in an orphanage, she said, her voice quiet, the words a fragile bridge spanning the chasm between them. The scent of old paper and dust hung in the air, a poignant backdrop to their shared history. I know, Arthur whispered, his gaze fixed on the photographs, the weight of his past actions pressing down on him. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the golden light. My mother, they said she was young, unmarried. She left me with a note, a single sunflower seed, tucked inside a tiny, worn locket. Isabella's fingers brushed the locket hidden beneath her sweater, a subtle movement betraying the depth of her buried emotions. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the ticking of an old grandfather clock in the hallway. My parents, they always said I was adopted, Arthur confessed, the words catching in his throat. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the plush cushions offering little comfort against the sharp edges of his guilt. They never spoke of it, never explained. The bitter taste of regret coated his tongue. He saw the shared pain mirrored in Isabella's eyes, a pain he had, unwittingly, amplified. The revelation hung between them, heavy with unspoken grief and the fragile hope of understanding. The photographs, silent witnesses to their fragmented past, served as a fragile link, a pathway to a future where healing, however slow, might be possible. The sunflowers outside, now bathed in the warm hues of the setting sun, seemed to offer a silent promise of a brighter tomorrow. The orphanage records were brittle with age, the ink faded but legible. Arthur traced the scrawled handwriting detailing Isabella's arrival, a tiny infant, abandoned with only a worn locket containing a single, dried sunflower seed. A lump formed in his throat, the same sunflower seed his mother had given him, a tiny, forgotten memory from a childhood he barely remembered. The air in the small, dusty room hung heavy with the weight of revelation. He looked up, finding Isabella's gaze fixed on him, a complex tapestry of hurt, confusion, and a flicker of something akin to understanding woven into her expression. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, painting dust motes dancing in the golden light. The silence was thick, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hallway. I can't believe it, Arthur finally whispered, his voice hoarse, The carefully constructed walls of his life, built on denial and self-preservation, had crumbled to dust. Isabella nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "Neither can I," she replied, her voice barely a breath. "All those years, the loneliness, and he was—" She trailed off, unable to articulate the depth of her betrayal. The weight of their shared history pressed down on them, an invisible force binding them together in a painful embrace. He saw the reflection of his own guilt mirrored in her eyes, a stark, unforgiving image of his heartless actions. The revelation wasn't just about their shared blood. It was about the decades of unspoken sorrow, the fractured lives, the immeasurable loss. He reached across the table, his hand hovering over hers. He knew a simple touch wouldn't erase the past, wouldn't magically mend the broken pieces of their lives. But it was a start, a tentative step toward acknowledging the devastating truth that connected them. He wanted to apologize, to somehow undo the irreparable damage, but the words seemed to stick in his throat, choked by the enormity of his guilt. He just sat there, feeling the weight of her silent pain, a painful reminder of his own failings. The scent of old paper and dust mingled with the faint aroma of lilies from a vase on the table, a poignant mix of decay and fragile beauty, mirroring the complexities of their newfound reality. The ticking clock seemed to mock their stillness, each second a relentless reminder of lost time, of a life irrevocably altered. The orphanage smelled of dust and faded lilies, a scent clinging to the worn wooden furniture and brittle records. Sunlight, fractured by the grimy window panes, illuminated motes dancing in the air, each a tiny, silent witness to their shared history. Isabella sat rigidly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the knuckles bone-white. Arthur watched her, his own hands trembling, the weight of his revelation pressing down like a physical burden. He cleared his throat, the sound raspy and strained. "The sunflower seed. It was my mother's," Isabella finished, her voice low, a single tear escaping and tracing a slow path down her cheek. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken words, years of hurt and misunderstanding. The ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway punctuated the stillness, each tick a sharp reminder of lost time. Arthur swallowed hard. I never knew." He felt the sting of tears in his own eyes, a surprising, unwelcome emotion. The callous indifference he'd always prided himself on felt brittle, shattered. He'd built his life on a foundation of lies, and it had crumbled beneath him. Isabella's gaze remained fixed on him, unwavering. "You abandoned me. You abandoned us." Her voice cracked, a raw, exposed wound. The anger, long suppressed, flickered in her eyes, a dangerous spark in the stillness of the room. "I know," he whispered, the words barely audible. He reached for her hand, hesitant, unsure. She didn't pull away, her fingers cold and stiff, intertwined with his. A fragile connection formed, a tenuous bridge across the chasm of years. He felt the cool smoothness of her skin against his, a physical reminder of their shared blood, their shared past. The locket, nestled in his pocket, felt heavy with the weight of his guilt. He'd built his life on rejecting his family, his heritage, and in doing so, he'd destroyed everything. This moment, this fragile connection, felt like the first step toward redemption, a terrifying, hopeful beginning. The weight of their shared sorrow hung between them, an invisible presence in the quiet room. But within that sorrow, a faint glimmer of understanding, a shared sorrow that transcended betrayal. The sunflower seed, a tiny symbol of a lost connection, lay dormant in their hands. Could it sprout anew? The orphanage matron, a woman whose face seemed etched with the sorrows of 1,000 lost children, offered them tea. The chipped china warmed Arthur's hands, a stark contrast to the icy chill that had settled deep in his bones. He watched Isabella, her profile sharp against the muted light filtering through the dusty window. Her silence was a heavy blanket, suffocating him. The air hung thick with unspoken accusations, the ghosts of their shared past whispering in the shadows. "It's a lot to process," Arthur finally said, his voice a low rumble, He felt the weight of his words, heavy and inadequate. Isabella merely nodded, her eyes fixed on the swirling tea in her cup. The delicate china trembled slightly in her stiff fingers. The matron, sensing the tension, quietly withdrew. A flashback pierced the present. Arthur, a small boy with sun-streaked hair, clutching a small, worn sunflower seed. He remembered his mother's gentle smile, the scent of lavender clinging to her dress. Then, the abrupt change, the unfamiliar faces, the sterile smell of the orphanage. The memory faded, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. He looked at Isabella, the subtle resemblance now impossible to ignore, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled. A smile he hadn't seen in years, the faint curve of her jawline. The shared sorrow was palpable, a tangible link binding them across decades of separation. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant city hum that filtered through the orphanage's ancient walls. He longed to reach for her, to offer some small comfort, but fear held him back, a wall built of years of neglect and self-deception. I'm so sorry, he repeated, the words catching in his throat. The apology felt hollow, inadequate, a pathetic attempt to mend a tapestry ripped apart by years of careless choices. He felt the hot sting of tears welling up, a testament to the years of emotional repression finally cracking. Isabella finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a complex mixture of sorrow, anger, and something else. A flicker of recognition, perhaps. The years of pain and loss were etched on her face, a roadmap of her silent suffering. The sunflower seed, a small token of their forgotten past, a tiny symbol of a lost connection, now lay in his palm, a tangible reminder of the debt he owed. The weight of his guilt was almost unbearable. He had abandoned not just a wife, but a sister. The truth resonated within the quiet, dust-filled room, a stark and unforgiving reality. The journey to redemption was long, arduous, but for the first time he dared to hope, a tiny fragile seed of hope in the fertile ground of his remorse. The orphanage's musty air hung heavy with the scent of old wood and forgotten things. Sunlight, weak and hesitant, filtered through the grimy window panes, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stillness. Isabella sat rigidly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the chipped teacup untouched. Arthur watched her, the sunflower seed, a relic from a forgotten past, burning a hole in his pocket. I didn't know, he began, his voice a hoarse whisper, lost in the vast emptiness of the room. The words felt inadequate, a pathetic attempt to bridge the chasm of years of neglect. He saw the flicker of something in Isabella's eyes, not forgiveness, not yet, but a glimmer of understanding, perhaps. A shared sorrow, a recognition of a fractured bond. Isabella finally spoke, her voice low and raspy. Knowing wouldn't have changed anything, would it, Arthur? The accusation hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving. He flinched, the weight of her words crushing him. He saw the pain etched on her face, the years of suffering reflected in her tired eyes. It was a mirror to his own soul, reflecting his own self-centeredness, his callous disregard. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, then retracted, the fear of rejection overwhelming him. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway, each tick a hammer blow to his conscience. He saw a flashback, fragmented and blurry, of a young girl, his younger self, their faces blurred, yet the subtle resemblance unmistakable. A shared laugh, a moment of carefree joy before the harsh reality of separation swallowed them whole. The memory vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving an ache in his chest. I want to make things right, he stammered, his voice cracking. He pulled out the sunflower seed, his fingers clumsy. I remember this, from before. He offered it to her, a fragile symbol of a connection he'd brutally severed. Isabella looked at the seed, then at him, her gaze intense and searching. He saw a flicker of something akin to pity in her eyes, but also a deep-seated hurt that decades of pain couldn't erase. The silence continued, heavy and pregnant with unspoken words, with years of regret. The journey ahead was long and arduous, fraught with challenges. But in the shared silence of that dusty orphanage room, a seed of hope, frail yet tenacious, began to take root. The sterile white walls of the hospital room seemed to amplify the silence, a stark contrast to the vibrant chaos of Arthur's usual life. Isabella, frail but resolute, sat by the window, sunlight illuminating the faint lines etched around her eyes, a testament to years of unshed tears. Arthur stood awkwardly, clutching a bouquet of lilies, a pathetic attempt at reconciliation. The scent, usually sweet, felt heavy and suffocating in the tense atmosphere. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the quiet room. "Isabella, I need to apologize." His voice, usually confident and commanding, trembled. He felt the weight of his past actions pressing down on him, a physical burden he couldn't escape. Isabella didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the distant cityscape, the city that had witnessed his ascent, his callous disregard, and now his desperate attempt at redemption. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor, a constant reminder of Isabella's vulnerability. He shifted uncomfortably, the lilies drooping slightly in his grasp. "The DNA results, they changed everything. I never knew." He wanted to scream the words, to shake the truth into her, but the words felt small, insignificant against the magnitude of his betrayal. A tear traced a path down Isabella's cheek, leaving a glistening trail. "Knowing wouldn't have changed a thing, Arthur," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the weight of years of pain. The accusation hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. He saw the pain etched onto her face, a reflection of his own guilt, magnified by her quiet suffering. He knew apologies wouldn't erase the past, but he had to try. He had to somehow bridge the chasm he himself had created. He moved closer, his hand reaching out tentatively. This time she didn't flinch. He gently took her hand, feeling the fragility of her bones beneath his touch. He held her gaze, searching for some sign of forgiveness, of understanding. In the depths of her eyes, he saw a glimmer of something he hadn't dared to hope for. A flicker of pity, mixed with a profound sadness. The journey toward redemption had begun, but the path ahead remained long and arduous. The seeds of forgiveness had been sown, but whether they would bloom remained uncertain. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the perfume Isabella usually wore, a fragrance Arthur now associated with a life irrevocably lost. He watched her, her hand tracing the delicate pattern of the hospital bedspread, a small, repetitive gesture that spoke volumes of her inner turmoil. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the fragility of her form. He cleared his throat again, the sound jarring in the quiet. I've been trying to find out more about our past." He began, his voice thick with unshed tears. The words felt clumsy, inadequate. He wished he could unravel the years of neglect, the callous choices that had led them to this desolate meeting. Isabella didn't look up. "There's nothing to know," she whispered, her voice raspy, like dry leaves rustling in the wind. The faintest tremor ran through her hand, betraying the composure she so carefully maintained. Arthur sat beside her, the weight of his guilt pressing down like a physical force. He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant. This time she didn't pull away. Her skin, once soft and vibrant, felt paper-thin beneath his fingers. "There are records," he continued, his voice low. "Documents from the orphanage, photographs, things that might help us understand." He spoke slowly, carefully choosing his words, conscious of the chasm that separated them, the years of pain and betrayal that hung between them like a suffocating fog. Isabella finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and something else, something that resembled understanding? He couldn't quite decipher it. "It doesn't change anything, Arthur," she said, her gaze unwavering. "It doesn't erase what you did. The words were soft but carried the force of a hurricane. The pain in her eyes was a tangible thing, sharper than any accusation. He nodded, his throat tight with emotion. I know, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends. I don't expect forgiveness, but... He paused, struggling to articulate the profound shame that consumed him. I want you to know how deeply I regret everything. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. The setting sun cast long shadows, painting the room in hues of orange and purple, a melancholic backdrop to their painful reconciliation. He knew this was just the beginning of a long and arduous journey. A journey towards redemption. A journey towards rebuilding a bond that should never have been broken. A bond of blood, forged in the shadows of a past they were only beginning to understand. The sterile scent of the hospital room clung to Arthur like a second skin. He watched Isabella, her face etched with a weariness that went beyond physical pain. The afternoon sun, filtering through the window, illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, each particle a tiny, shimmering reminder of time slipping away. He shifted uncomfortably in the plastic chair, the cheap vinyl sticking to his expensive suit. The orphanage records. They mention a woman named Eleanor. Arthur began, his voice a low rumble. He held a worn photograph in his trembling hand, a faded image of two young girls, one strikingly similar to Isabella. She was your mother. Isabella's eyes, usually bright and full of life, were now clouded with a sorrow so deep it chilled him to the bone. She didn't speak, merely stared at the photograph, her fingers tracing the outline of one girl's face. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. Eleanor, she gave you up for adoption, Arthur continued, his voice catching. The guilt gnawed at him, a relentless beast. She never stopped looking for you. A single tear escaped Isabella's eye, tracing a slow path down her cheek. The fragility of her body, the stillness of her posture, underscored the immense pain she carried. It wasn't just the accident. It was the betrayal, the abandonment, the years of unanswered questions. Why? She finally whispered, her voice barely audible. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. It was the question that had haunted Arthur for weeks, the question that echoed in the empty spaces of his opulent mansion, a constant, nagging reminder of his cruelty. Fear, he confessed, his voice raw with emotion. Fear of responsibility, fear of everything. I was selfish, Isabella, inhumanely selfish. He looked at her, his gaze pleading. He saw in her eyes a flicker of understanding, a subtle shift in the glacial wall she'd erected around her heart. Perhaps, just perhaps, the long road to forgiveness had begun. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, painting the scene in hues of deepening twilight, mirroring the complex, evolving emotions that filled the space between them. The crisp morning air, infused with the scent of pine from the nearby park, offered a stark contrast to the sterile hospital room. Arthur, clad in a simple sweater instead of his usual tailored suits, sat beside Isabella's bed. He'd brought her a bouquet of lilies, their delicate fragrance a fragile attempt at peacemaking. Isabella, her face pale but somehow softer, traced the delicate petals with a trembling finger. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, a constant companion for weeks, was a subdued counterpoint to the quiet hum of the city beyond the window. I hired a team to manage your physical therapy, Arthur began, his voice hesitant, a stark departure from his usual confident tone. He felt the weight of his past actions pressing down on him, a heavy cloak of guilt. The lilies, beautiful in their simplicity, felt like a pathetic offering. Isabella's gaze remained fixed on the flowers. I don't need your charity, Arthur, she said, her voice low but steady, her words carrying the sting of years of hurt. He flinched. It's not charity, Isabella. It's amends. I want to help you to make things right. He swallowed, the lump in his throat a physical manifestation of his remorse. The silence that followed felt monumental, heavy with unspoken accusations and desperate pleas for forgiveness. He reached for her hand, his touch tentative. Her skin, once vibrant and full of life, was now fragile, thin. The contact sent a jolt of fear through him, the fear of rejection, of being once again cast aside. Isabella didn't pull away. Her eyes, though still filled with sadness, held a spark of something else. Something that might be hope, or perhaps just a weary acceptance. The therapy is... well, it is something, she conceded, her voice barely a whisper. A small, almost imperceptible nod indicated a grudging acknowledgement of his efforts. The sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a silent witness to the fragile beginning of their reconciliation. The journey would be long and arduous, filled with obstacles and emotional setbacks. Yet, in that quiet hospital room, bathed in the soft light of a new day, the possibility of healing, of forgiveness, flickered like a fragile flame. A flame Arthur desperately hoped wouldn't be extinguished. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Arthur like a second skin. He watched Isabella, her face a landscape of fatigue etched by time and hardship, sipping lukewarm tea. Sunlight slanted through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. A silent, melancholic ballet. He'd brought her favorite lavender biscuits, a small gesture that felt woefully inadequate. The silence stretched, heavy and thick, punctuated only by the soft clinking of her spoon against the porcelain. The lawyers, they've finalized the trust, he finally said, his voice a low rumble. The words felt clumsy, inadequate to express the enormity of his actions, the depth of his remorse. Isabella looked up, her eyes, the same shade of hazel as his, filled with a weariness that chilled him to the bone. I don't need your money, Arthur, she said, her voice soft but firm, each word carefully chosen, each syllable laden with unspoken pain. He winced. It's not just money, Isabella. It's for your care, for your future, to make things right. The words caught in his throat, choked by the weight of his guilt. He saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes, a fragile spark of hope amidst the ashes of betrayal. He reached across the small table, his hand hovering over hers. He'd spent weeks rehearsing this moment, crafting the perfect apology, but the words seemed to evaporate the moment they neared his lips. I'm sorry, he stammered, the apology tasting like ash in his mouth. It felt so insufficient, so pathetically inadequate for the devastation he'd caused. Isabella's gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers twisting around the spoon. The faintest tremor betrayed her inner turmoil. The scent of lavender, usually calming, now felt suffocating, a constant reminder of his failure. He saw a tear trace a path down her cheek, a single silent testament to the enduring wounds he'd inflicted. He longed to reach out, to touch her, to offer some solace, but he hesitated, afraid to break the fragile truce that had settled between them. The air in the room thrummed with unspoken emotions, a complex symphony of regret, hurt, and the fragile possibility of reconciliation. The journey to forgiveness, he knew, was just beginning. The physiotherapy clinic hummed with the low thrum of machines and hushed whispers. Sunlight, filtered through frosted glass, cast long shadows across the polished floor. Arthur watched Isabella, her face pale but resolute, painstakingly lifting a small weight. Each movement was a testament to her resilience, a slow, agonizing climb back from the abyss of his neglect. The scent of antiseptic and liniment mingled with the faint floral fragrance of the air freshener, a jarring contrast to the sterile environment. He felt a pang of guilt, sharper than any he'd experienced before. This wasn't about money. It was about witnessing the toll his actions had taken. He approached cautiously, his footsteps echoing softly. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice hesitant, unsure of the right words. Isabella paused, her eyes meeting his. There was no warmth in them, only a quiet reserve, a wall erected against the pain he'd inflicted. "Tired," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The simple word held the weight of unspoken suffering, years of struggle, and the crushing burden of betrayal. He wanted to reach out, to touch her hand, but restrained himself, recognizing the unspoken boundaries. I arranged for a specialist to review your file, he said, offering a tentative olive branch. Someone who specializes in cases like yours. He watched her closely, searching for a flicker of response. Any indication that his efforts weren't entirely futile. A faint tremor ran through Isabella's shoulders. He saw the ghost of a smile play on her lips, almost imperceptible, but enough to ignite a tiny spark of hope within him. "Thank you, Arthur," she said, her voice still soft, yet with a newfound strength. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was an acknowledgement of his efforts, a crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. He knew the road to redemption was long, arduous, and fraught with peril, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope that he might, just might, earn back a sliver of her trust. The air crackled with unspoken emotions, a silent conversation of pain, regret, and the hesitant beginning of healing. The journey was far from over, but the first tentative steps had been taken. The sterile scent of the hospital room clung to Arthur like a second skin. He sat stiffly in the plastic chair, the cheap vinyl digging into his thighs. He watched Isabella, bathed in the pale light filtering through the window, her fingers tracing the delicate pattern of her worn quilt. The silence was thick, heavy with unspoken words and the ghosts of past hurts. He'd brought a bouquet of lilies, their pristine white a stark contrast to the muted grays of the room. They sat untouched on the bedside table, a silent offering of apology. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the quiet space. I spoke to the hospital administrator. He began, his voice a low rumble. About getting you moved to a private room, a more comfortable one. Isabella didn't look up, her gaze fixed on the quilt. The faintest tremor ran through her hand. The weight of his words hung between them, heavy and unacknowledged. He saw the flicker of something in her eyes. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps a hint of surprise. A small victory. "It's unnecessary," she finally said, her voice barely audible, a wisp of sound against the silence. Her words carried a subtle edge, a carefully constructed wall against his attempts at reconciliation. He persisted. "I also arranged for a home health aide, someone to help you with everything, around the clock if you want." He watched her, his heart clenching with each passing moment. He'd never known such profound helplessness, this desperate need for acceptance. A sigh escaped Isabella's lips, a sound filled with weariness and pain. She finally looked at him, her eyes reflecting a lifetime of sorrow, and yet a faint spark of something else. Hope, perhaps. He couldn't be sure. "Arthur?" she began, her voice low and strained, each word measured and deliberate. "Your actions, they weren't just thoughtless, they were cruel." The accusation hung in the air, a stark reminder of the chasm between them. The lilies, symbols of his contrition, seemed to wilt under the weight of her words. He nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He deserved her anger, her resentment. He'd earned it 1,000 times over. "I know," he whispered, the single word carrying the burden of his guilt. The silence that followed was not heavy, but pregnant with the possibility of change, with the slow, arduous climb toward a fragile reconciliation. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope, a faint, fragile promise of healing. The afternoon sun, weak and watery, filtered through the hospital window, casting long shadows across Isabella's room. The air, thick with the smell of antiseptic and lilies, felt heavy with unspoken words. Arthur watched her, a fragile silhouette against the pale light, her hands still tracing the worn quilt. He'd brought her a book, a collection of poetry she'd once mentioned liking. It lay unopened on the bedside table, another silent offering. He cleared his throat, the sound brittle in the stillness. "Isabella," he began, his voice rough with emotion. I know there's no excuse." She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the intricate stitching of the quilt. The silence stretched, taut and uncomfortable, a stark contrast to the opulent quiet of his own life. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, suffocating. "There are things I want to say," he continued, his voice catching. "Things I should have said a long time ago, about us." The word us felt strange, foreign, yet resonated with a painful familiarity. Finally, she turned, her eyes, once bright and full of life, now held a deep well of sadness. "Saying them now doesn't change what you did, Arthur." Her voice was soft, but the words held the weight of unshed tears, years of hurt. A tremor ran through him. He felt the familiar chill of self-loathing. He reached out, hesitantly, his hand hovering over hers. She didn't pull away. Her skin, cool and delicate under his touch, felt incredibly fragile. "I know," he whispered, the words a choked sob. "I know I hurt you, terribly, and I was wrong, so profoundly, irrevocably wrong." He paused, the silence punctuated by the rhythmic beeping of a machine monitoring her vitals. I want to make amends." Her gaze softened slightly, but the pain remained etched in the lines around her eyes. "Making amends isn't as simple as saying you're sorry, Arthur." Her voice was laced with a quiet strength, a resilience he hadn't noticed before, buried under layers of grief. He saw a flicker of something else, too, perhaps, a sliver of forgiveness. A fragile hope bloomed within him, tentative and uncertain, yet stubbornly persistent. The scent of lavender, Isabella's favorite, hung faintly in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile hospital smell. Arthur sat beside her bed, the worn poetry book still unopened. He watched her fingers, thin and pale, gently stroking the soft fabric of her quilt. The silence stretched, a heavy blanket woven with years of unspoken regrets. He swallowed, the lump in his throat a painful reminder of his past callousness. "Isabella," he began again, his voice barely a whisper. "I've arranged for a private nurse, 24/7 care, anything you need." She finally looked at him, her eyes, though still clouded with sadness, held a spark of something else. Maybe defiance, maybe guarded hope. The flicker made his chest ache with a mixture of guilt and a tentative, fragile joy. "It's kind," she admitted, her voice raspy, "but it doesn't erase what you did." He nodded, understanding the depth of her pain, the chasm he had created between them. "I know," he said, his gaze falling to his hands, "and I won't expect forgiveness, but I want to try to be better, to be the brother I should have been." The word brother hung in the air, heavy and unfamiliar, yet strangely comforting. A soft smile touched her lips, a ghost of the vibrant woman he'd once known. "You're still learning, Arthur," she said, her voice stronger now. "But I'm willing to let you try." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a tear that held not just sorrow, but something akin to acceptance. The afternoon sun shifted, painting the room in a new light, softer, gentler, hinting at the possibility of healing. The air, still heavy with the past, now carried a whisper of hope, fragile yet persistent. The journey to redemption was just beginning. The rehabilitation center was a stark contrast to Arthur's opulent penthouse. Muted colors, the scent of antiseptic mingling faintly with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, replaced the heady perfume of expensive lilies and the sharp tang of champagne. He sat awkwardly on a stiff chair, watching Isabella through the window. Sunlight streamed through the glass, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a poignant metaphor for the fragility of their newfound relationship. She was on the patio, a wheelchair bathed in the golden light, a book resting unopened on her lap. The slight tremor in her hand as she reached for a cup of tea was a stark reminder of the accident that had shattered more than just her bones. Arthur cleared his throat. "The weather's pleasant today," he offered, the words sounding inadequate, clumsy, like a child reaching for a precious jewel with clumsy fingers. Isabella looked up, her gaze distant, reflecting the vast chasm that still separated them. "It is," she replied, her voice a low murmur, barely audible above the gentle chirping of birds. The casualness of her response felt carefully constructed, a wall built brick by brick. He shifted uncomfortably. I wanted to apologize again, he began, his voice thick with unshed tears. For everything. For abandoning you. He watched her carefully, searching her face for any sign of forgiveness, any glimmer of understanding. There was nothing, only the faintest trace of sadness, a sadness that mirrored the ache in his own heart. Silence descended, heavy and suffocating, punctuated only by the distant hum of a passing car and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, suffocating him with the realization of the irreparable damage he had caused. He wanted to reach out to her, to touch her hand, but he hesitated, fearing he would shatter the delicate balance they had somehow managed to achieve. His guilt was a relentless tide, threatening to overwhelm him, pulling him under. He was learning the true cost of his selfishness, and the journey to redemption felt daunting, almost insurmountable. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the patio, extending the silence between them. A silence pregnant with unspoken words, unresolved emotions, and the haunting weight of their shared past. Days bled into weeks. The initial awkward silences during Arthur's visits to the rehabilitation center gradually softened. The scent of antiseptic no longer felt so sharp, replaced by the comforting aroma of Isabella's chamomile tea. He brought her books and novels she'd mentioned enjoying years ago, a subtle attempt at reconnecting through shared memories. One afternoon, sunlight painted the patio in warm hues, illuminating Isabella's gentle smile as she traced a finger across the embossed cover of a worn leather-bound edition of Jane Austen. "I remember you reading this," Arthur said, his voice hesitant, yet softer than it had been. Isabella nodded, her eyes mirroring the golden light. "It's comforting," she whispered, her gaze drifting to the distant hills. "Familiar." The word hung in the air, a fragile bridge between their fractured past. Arthur saw a flicker of something else in her eyes, a tentative acceptance, a fragile hope. He watched as she carefully sipped her tea, the tremor in her hand barely perceptible. The physical distance between them felt less insurmountable now. The emotional chasm, however, remained a daunting landscape. He felt a surge of guilt, a sharp pang of regret that pierced through the tentative calm. He had stolen years from her, years of shared laughter, shared lives, stolen by his own callous indifference. That evening, after helping Isabella settle into her room, Arthur stayed a little longer. He sat beside her, the silence comfortable now, woven with the soft rustle of turning pages. He reached for her hand, his touch tentative, hesitant. She didn't pull away. Instead, she lightly squeezed his fingers, a gesture that spoke volumes more than any word could express. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. It was a tear of grief, yes, but also one of quiet understanding, of slow, agonizing forgiveness. The sun had set, casting long shadows across the room, but a soft glow remained, a testament to the fragile yet resilient hope blooming between them. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Arthur felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile tendril of redemption intertwining with the enduring pain. The crisp autumn air, scented with wood smoke and damp earth, chilled Arthur to the bone. He sat beside Isabella, the muted glow of the hospital lamp illuminating the delicate lines etched around her eyes, lines that spoke of untold suffering, yet also of an inner resilience that both humbled and inspired him. He cleared his throat, the sound jarring in the quiet room. "Isabella," he began, his voice a low rumble. I know I can't undo the past." His words felt clumsy, inadequate to express the weight of his guilt. He watched as her gaze drifted to the window, the city lights blurring into a shimmering tapestry. "There's no undoing it, Arthur," she replied, her voice soft, almost fragile. He flinched at the formality of her tone. A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words, years of lost connection. He reached for her hand again, his touch hesitant, but this time she didn't pull away. Her fingers, thin and delicate, intertwined with his. He felt a surge of emotion, a raw, painful mixture of remorse and a nascent hope. "I want to make things right," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to help, to be here for you." He squeezed her hand gently, feeling the warmth of her skin against his. Isabella looked at him then, her eyes, though still shadowed with pain, held a glimmer of something else, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even forgiveness. "It's a long road, Arthur," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "A long, difficult road." He nodded, his throat tight with unshed tears. He knew the road ahead would be arduous. He'd shattered her life, their potential shared life, replaced with self-serving ambition and cold indifference. But in this shared silence, in the simple clasp of their hands, he saw a tentative path toward redemption, toward rebuilding what he had so carelessly destroyed. The journey to healing had begun, but it was a journey that required more than just amends. It demanded a fundamental change within himself. And Arthur, for the first time, felt ready to begin. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the vibrant autumn colors filtering through the hospital window. Arthur watched Isabella, sunlight catching the silver in her hair, highlighting the fragility etched onto her face. He'd brought her a book, a first edition of her favorite author, a small gesture in the face of his monumental failings. He placed it gently on the bedside table, his hands trembling slightly. I found this," he stammered, his voice cracking. The words felt inadequate, pathetically small against the chasm of his betrayal. Isabella's gaze remained fixed on the book, her expression unreadable. A long silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. The sound was a relentless reminder of her vulnerability, a stark counterpoint to the opulent silence of his mansion. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and husky. "Thank you, Arthur." The words were devoid of warmth, a careful formality that cut him deeper than any outright accusation. He shifted uncomfortably in the chair. I want to help." He began again, the words catching in his throat. "I want to make things right." He longed to reach for her hand, but hesitated, the memory of his past callousness a heavy weight on his chest. A tear traced a path down Isabella's cheek, leaving a glistening trail in its wake. It wasn't a tear of anger, he realized with a jolt, but one of profound sadness, a silent testament to the years of pain he'd inflicted. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't about amends. It was about understanding the depth of his cruelty and accepting the long, arduous path of earning back even a fraction of her trust. The weight of that realization settled heavily upon him, heavier than any guilt he had previously felt. The silence, once heavy with unspoken accusations, now felt pregnant with a dawning understanding, a fragile hope flickering in the shadows of his remorse. He had a long way to go, a lifetime perhaps, to prove that the change within him was genuine. But the journey, however long and arduous, had begun. The crisp morning air, scented with pine and damp earth, offered a stark contrast to the sterile hospital room. Arthur sat beside Isabella's bed, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor a constant, unsettling metronome. He'd brought her sunflowers, their bright faces a jarring counterpoint to the muted grays of the room. He watched her sleep, the lines etched around her eyes telling a story of pain and resilience. He felt a familiar pang of guilt, sharp and insistent. He reached out, his fingers hovering over her hand. He longed to touch her, to somehow bridge the vast chasm of his betrayal, but he hesitated. The memory of his callous abandonment, of his selfish escape, was a heavy weight on his chest. He thought about how differently he could have treated her. A soft sigh escaped Isabella's lips. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him, her gaze unwavering. The years of neglect, the pain, the betrayal, it all reflected in those beautiful, weary eyes. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "The flowers are beautiful," she whispered, her voice raspy but clear. The words, though seemingly simple, held a profound weight. I wanted to do something," Arthur stammered, his voice choked with emotion. He fumbled with the sunflowers, their bright petals seeming to mock his clumsy attempt at redemption. "I'm sorry, Isabella. Truly sorry." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps a hint of recognition, a sliver of understanding. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the soft whir of the machines and the quiet rustling of the sunflowers. He spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "I know saying sorry isn't enough, but I want to make things right, to be there for you, to be the brother you deserve." The word brother hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their shared past and the painful truth of their present. Isabella's gaze softened, ever so slightly. The deep sadness still lingered, but something else emerged, a spark of hope, fragile yet persistent, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. The journey ahead would be long and arduous, but for the first time since his abandonment, Arthur felt a glimmer of hope. The fragile seed of reconciliation had been planted. The healing could begin. The therapist's office smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Arthur fidgeted, the plush armchair feeling oddly uncomfortable. He'd been coming for weeks, the sessions a grueling excavation of his past. He confessed his abandonment of Isabella, the shallowness of his motivations, the callous disregard for her suffering. He'd expected anger, perhaps even disgust from Dr. Evans, but instead, the therapist listened with a quiet empathy that both unnerved and soothed him. "The guilt is consuming you, isn't it, Dr. Evans' voice was gentle, a counterpoint to the turmoil raging within Arthur. He nodded, unable to speak past the thick knot in his throat. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a physical burden he couldn't escape. He thought of Isabella, her quiet strength, the resilience that shone through even in her darkest moments. He'd seen it in her eyes, a flicker of forgiveness mixed with profound hurt. "It's not just guilt, is it, Dr. Evans prompted, her gaze steady. "There's also fear." Arthur flinched. Fear? Yes, fear of facing the truth about himself, about the depths of his selfishness. Fear of losing Isabella again, this time not through abandonment, but through his own inadequacy. The fear of rejection gnawed at him, a constant undercurrent to his remorse. I don't know how to be a brother," he finally managed, his voice barely a whisper. The admission felt raw, vulnerable. He'd spent his life avoiding vulnerability, burying it under layers of wealth and superficial relationships. Dr. Evans leaned forward. "It's a new role, Arthur. It will take time, patience, and a willingness to learn. But the fact you're here, facing this, suggests you're ready to begin." He looked at his hands, calloused and unused to honest work. He thought of the sunflowers he'd brought to Isabella, a small gesture, a clumsy attempt at reconciliation. He needed to do more, much more. The path to redemption was long and arduous, fraught with obstacles, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. The hope of healing, of forgiveness, of finally becoming the brother Isabella deserved. The journey had only just begun. The scent of salt and seaweed hung heavy in the air as Isabella sat on the weathered bench overlooking the ocean. The rhythmic crash of waves against the shore was a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil within her. The sun, a warm hand on her skin, did little to dispel the lingering chill in her heart. Arthur's visits had become more frequent, his apologies more heartfelt, yet a chasm remained. She saw the genuine remorse in his eyes, the struggle in his posture, but trust, like a fragile seedling, needed time to grow. A seagull cried overhead, its call sharp against the gentle murmur of the waves. Arthur approached, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the gray sky. He sat beside her, a respectful distance maintained, a silent acknowledgement of the delicate space between them. I brought these," he said, his voice low, hesitant. He offered the flowers, his hand trembling slightly. Isabella took them, her fingers brushing against his. A jolt, a flicker of the connection they'd once shared, even if it had been twisted and broken beyond recognition. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ocean's roar. Silence settled between them, heavy and pregnant with unspoken emotions. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the sand. The air grew cooler, a subtle shift that mirrored the subtle shifts in their relationship. Arthur finally broke the silence. I know saying sorry isn't enough," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "But I want you to know, I'm trying. I'm really trying to be a better person, a better brother." Isabella looked out at the vast expanse of the ocean, the waves relentless in their rhythm. "It's hard," she admitted, her voice catching. "It's hard to forget, to forgive." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the already hazy horizon. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers, then retracting as if burned. The unspoken question hung in the air. Could they truly bridge the chasm created by years of neglect and betrayal? The answer, like the unpredictable tides, remained elusive, a testament to the complexities of healing and the enduring power of familial bonds. But in the shared silence, amidst the crashing waves and fading sunlight, a fragile hope began to take root. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to the air in Isabella's new apartment, a stark contrast to the salty tang of the ocean air where she'd last seen Arthur. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the carefully chosen, minimalist furnishings. It felt empty. A sharp pang of loneliness pierced her, a familiar ache. She traced the rim of a chipped teacup, the porcelain cool against her fingertips, a small comfort in the vast silence. Her phone buzzed, a message from Arthur. Her hand hovered over it, hesitant. She finally opened it. "Thinking of you. The physiotherapist recommended a new hydrotherapy center. I made an appointment for tomorrow afternoon. Let me know if the time works." The words were simple, devoid of grand gestures, yet they carried a weight of sincere effort. A small, hopeful flame flickered in her chest. The next day, the hydrotherapy pool was warm and soothing. The gentle currents massaged her aching muscles, easing the persistent stiffness. Arthur waited patiently by the side, his gaze soft, avoiding the intensity of direct eye contact. He wasn't hovering, but his presence was a quiet reassurance. As she emerged, wrapped in a soft towel, he handed her a steaming mug. "Herbal tea," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "Chamomile and lavender, supposed to help with relaxation." She took the mug, her fingers brushing his. The brief contact sent a jolt through her, a fleeting reminder of their shared past, a ghost of intimacy now tinged with the bitter knowledge of betrayal. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice husky. The silence that followed was less strained than before, felt lighter. Later, sitting in a comfortable armchair near the pool, Arthur spoke, his words carefully chosen. "I've been reflecting on everything, my actions, my selfishness. The therapy is helping me understand the roots of it all. The abandonment issues, the fear of commitment." He hesitated, his voice cracking slightly. "And I understand now, truly understand, the hurt I caused you. It's unforgivable." Isabella met his gaze, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. The raw emotion in his voice, the vulnerability in his posture, was slowly chipping away at the icy wall she'd built around her heart. The ocean of her pain was still vast, but a small island of forgiveness was beginning to emerge from the depths. The road to healing would be long, arduous. But in that quiet moment, shared in the warmth of the hydrotherapy center, a fragile seed of hope had been planted, nurtured by a genuine apology and a sincere attempt at amends. The therapist's office smelled faintly of sandalwood and old leather. Arthur fidgeted, the plush armchair offering little comfort. He watched the dust motes dance in the afternoon sunbeams slicing through the blinds, each tiny particle a symbol of the shattered pieces of his life. He'd spent weeks in therapy, peeling back layers of ingrained selfishness, confronting the chilling reality of his past actions. His guilt felt less like a sharp stab now, more a dull ache, a constant companion. The anger towards Isabella. "It's understandable, Doctor." Evan's calm voice broke through his reverie. "But it's hindering your progress. You need to address that before you can truly move forward." Arthur sighed, the sound heavy with regret. I don't know how. I betrayed her. I abandoned her when she needed me most. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. And you betrayed yourself, Doctor, Evans added gently. Denying your connection to her was denying a part of yourself. Now you have the opportunity to rebuild that connection, not as husband and wife, but as siblings. A chance to mend the fractured bonds of your past. That night, Arthur sat on his balcony. The city lights a glittering tapestry below. He thought of Isabella, her quiet strength, her resilience. He picked up his phone, his fingers hovering over her number. He felt a tremor of fear, a resurgence of the self-doubt that had plagued him for so long. Would she even answer? Would she ever forgive him? He typed a simple message. Thinking of you. How are you feeling today? He hit send, and a wave of nervous anticipation washed over him. The chime of her reply was almost immediate. Better than yesterday. The new physio sessions are helping. Thank you. Simple words, yet they held a glimmer of hope, a fragile promise of healing. The crisp autumn air nipped at Isabella's cheeks as she sat on her balcony. The city sprawling beneath her like a glittering, indifferent beast. The physiotherapy had helped, easing the stiffness in her limbs, but the emotional ache remained, a dull throb beneath the surface. Arthur's message, a simple thinking of you, had surprised her. It felt tentative, fragile, like a butterfly's wing. She'd replied, but the words felt inadequate, a thin veil over the chasm of hurt that separated them. Days bled into weeks. Arthur's visits became more frequent, less formal. He brought her books, her favorite herbal tea, even a small, mischievous kitten who promptly tangled itself in her shawl. These small gestures, devoid of grand pronouncements or forced apologies, began to chip away at the icy wall she'd erected around her heart. One evening, he found her sketching. The charcoal smudged on the paper depicted a fierce bird, wings outstretched in defiant flight. "It's beautiful," he murmured, his voice soft. The scent of wood smoke and autumn leaves clung to his coat. Isabella looked up, her eyes meeting his. "It's about survival," she said, her voice barely a whisper, the words heavy with unspoken pain. He sat beside her, the silence comfortable now, punctuated only by the rustling of leaves outside. "I understand survival," he confessed, his gaze fixed on the sketch. "I spent so long surviving, I forgot how to truly live." A tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. "You almost destroyed my will to live," she whispered, the words laced with raw emotion, a mixture of pain and lingering hope. He reached out, his touch hesitant, as if afraid to break something delicate. She didn't pull away. His hand covered hers, his touch warm and reassuring. "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make amends." The weight of his confession hung heavy in the air, a promise as fragile as the autumn leaves swirling below. The path to forgiveness was long and arduous, but in that shared moment of quiet understanding, a tiny spark of healing ignited. The city lights twinkled below, a silent witness to a nascent reconciliation. The Christmas lights twinkled, casting a warm glow on the snow-dusted cityscape visible from Isabella's window. Arthur sat opposite her, a hesitant smile playing on his lips. He'd brought a box of her favorite chocolates, their rich aroma filling the quiet room. I wanted to apologize again," he began, his voice thick with genuine remorse. The words hung in the air, fragile and tentative. Isabella met his gaze, her eyes reflecting the soft light. The anger that had once consumed her had softened, replaced by a weary acceptance. "The apologies are superfluous, Arthur," she said softly, her voice tinged with a sadness that resonated deep within him. "What matters now is what you do." He nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. He'd spent months trying to atone, not just with grand gestures, but with small acts of consistent care. He'd even begun volunteering at the rehabilitation center where she'd spent months recovering, a stark contrast to his former self-absorbed existence. The transformation wasn't complete, but it was palpable. He reached across the small table, his hand hovering over hers. I know I can't erase the past, he whispered, his voice raspy with emotion. But I want to be a part of your future, not as a husband, but as a brother, as family. The silence that followed wasn't strained. It was the quiet hum of unspoken understanding, a recognition of shared pain and a tentative step towards healing. The aroma of the chocolates mingled with the scent of pine from the small Christmas tree in the corner, creating a surprisingly comforting atmosphere. Isabella's hand finally met his, a delicate touch that spoke volumes. It wasn't forgiveness yet, not fully, but it was a beginning, a fragile, hopeful beginning, like a tiny seedling pushing its way through the hardened earth, reaching for the light. The city lights flickered outside, a silent witness to a bond reforged, stronger now, perhaps, for having been tested by fire. The following spring, Isabella's apartment, bathed in the warm afternoon sun, felt less like a refuge and more like a blossoming space. Sunlight streamed through the large window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The scent of lilies, Arthur's weekly offering, mingled with the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee. He sat across from her, a sketchbook resting on the small table between them, its pages filled with charcoal sketches, surprisingly detailed portraits of Isabella, capturing her quiet strength and resilience. "These are beautiful, Arthur," Isabella said, her voice soft, a touch of surprise in its timbre. She traced the delicate line of her own cheekbone in one of the sketches, a subtle smile playing on her lips. The anger had long since faded, replaced by a cautious hope. Arthur's gaze, usually sharp and calculating, held a hesitant gentleness. I wanted to capture something of you beyond the illness, beyond everything." He paused, his throat tightening. The guilt still gnawed at him, a constant, unwelcome companion. "You've been different," Isabella observed, her eyes searching his, more present. He nodded slowly. "Therapy helped. I'm learning to see things differently, to accept responsibility, to understand the depth of my own failings." He picked up a pencil, nervously sketching a single lily on a blank page. The simple act felt charged with unspoken meaning. "I still can't forgive everything," Isabella admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "But I see the effort, the change. It's real." Silence descended, comfortable this time, filled only with the gentle rustle of turning pages and the quiet hum of the city outside. The sketchbook, a symbol of his remorse, sat between them, a testament to his evolving relationship with his sister. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room, highlighting the fragile, tentative peace that had finally settled between them. It wasn't a perfect peace, nor a complete reconciliation, but a beginning, a step toward a future where brother and sister could find solace and understanding in the shared burden of their past. The scent of lilies lingered in the air, a poignant reminder of a journey toward healing, a journey still underway but filled with the promise of a new dawn. The crisp autumn air nipped at Arthur's cheeks as he walked Isabella's dog, a fluffy Samoyed named Cloud, through the park. Leaves, a fiery tapestry of red and gold, crunched under their feet. The silence between them wasn't strained, but companionable, a quiet acknowledgement of the shared past that still lingered like the scent of wood smoke on a chilly evening. Cloud, oblivious to their unspoken emotions, bounded ahead, his white fur a stark contrast to the vibrant foliage. "He reminds me of you," Isabella said, her voice barely audible above the rustling leaves. Arthur glanced at her, surprised. Her gaze was fixed on Cloud, but a faint blush touched her cheeks. He saw a flicker of something he hadn't seen before, a hesitant warmth that softened the edges of her lingering resentment. "How so?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. "The way he bounces through life," Isabella replied, a small smile playing on her lips, unaware of the shadows, always looking for joy. Arthur chuckled, a genuine laugh that surprised him as much as it did her. "I wasn't always so blind to the shadows." He paused, studying the dog's playful antics. "Perhaps that's what I need to learn from him, to find joy again, even amidst the darkness." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, The rhythmic thud of clouds paused a soothing counterpoint to the rustling leaves. The setting sun cast long, dramatic shadows across the park, painting the scene in hues of orange and purple. As they approached a bench overlooking a tranquil pond, Isabella stopped, her breath misting in the cold air. "This is where we used to come as children," she whispered, a faint sadness coloring her tone. The memory, a shared secret from a life they'd both forgotten, hung heavy in the air. Arthur felt a pang of guilt, a sharp reminder of the years stolen from them, the bond severed by circumstance and his own selfish choices. He reached out, hesitantly, and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes of regret, of a yearning for connection, of a brother's love long overdue. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint aroma of wood smoke from the fireplace, a comforting blend filling Arthur's renovated apartment. Isabella sat across from him, her gaze fixed on the swirling steam rising from her mug. The plush, cream-colored sofa felt oddly formal, a stark contrast to the casual intimacy that had begun to bloom between them. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a silent testament to the passage of time and the slow process of healing. "It's different," Isabella finally said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. The words hung in the air, unspoken anxieties clinging to them like morning dew. She didn't need to specify. Both knew exactly what different referred to their relationship. The awkwardness wasn't gone, but it had softened, replaced by a tentative understanding. Arthur nodded, a complex tapestry of emotions swirling within him. Guilt still gnawed at him, a persistent ache under the surface of his newfound peace. "Yes," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "It is, and it's good. Better than I ever could have hoped for." He reached across the small space between them, his fingers brushing against hers. She didn't pull away. A comfortable silence settled between them, punctuated only by the gentle crackling of the fire and the distant city hum. It was a silence born not of awkwardness, but of shared understanding, of a profound bond forged in the crucible of betrayal and rediscovery. The weight of their shared past remained, a silent presence in the room, but it no longer overshadowed the fragile hope that was beginning to blossom. Arthur felt a surge of gratitude for Isabella's resilience, for her capacity for forgiveness, and for the unexpected gift of this newfound familial connection. He knew the road ahead was long, that the scars of the past would remain, but for the first time in a very long time, Arthur felt a genuine sense of peace, a quiet certainty that, together, they could navigate the complexities of their relationship and find a way forward. The crisp autumn air bit at Arthur's cheeks as he walked towards the hospital, the familiar scent of antiseptic stinging his nostrils. He carried a bouquet of sunflowers, their bright faces a stark contrast to the somber mood clinging to the sterile building. He hadn't visited Isabella in weeks, a silent battle waged within him between guilt and fear. He knew he deserved her anger, her silence. He found her in the sunroom, bathed in the warm glow of the late afternoon light. Her eyes, usually sparkling with intelligence, held a weary stillness. She looked fragile, her thin frame swallowed by the oversized armchair. He placed the sunflowers on the small table beside her. I didn't mean to stay away so long," he stammered, his voice thick with unshed tears. Isabella's gaze remained fixed on the flowers. "Actions speak louder than words, Arthur," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the weight of unspoken pain. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the gentle rustling of leaves outside the window. Arthur swallowed, his throat dry. "I know, and I'm trying to make amends, to be better, for both of us." He reached out, his hand hovering over hers. This time she didn't pull away. Her touch was hesitant, cautious, as if testing the waters after a long, bitter winter. A tear traced a path down Isabella's cheek, reflecting the sunlight. "It's not easy," she said, her voice cracking. "Forgiving you, it's a process, a long, painful process." Arthur nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. He didn't expect forgiveness, not yet. He just wanted to begin the arduous journey of earning it, of proving that he could change, that the man who abandoned her was a ghost of his former self. He squeezed her hand gently, a silent promise hanging in the air between them. The sunflowers, vibrant and strong, seemed to mirror the fragile hope that was finally beginning to blossom. The scent of antiseptic still lingered, but it was slowly being replaced by something else, the tentative, yet unmistakable, scent of healing. The following weeks were a blur of awkward silences and tentative gestures. Arthur, haunted by the revelation, found himself drawn to Isabella's quiet strength. He started visiting her daily, bringing small gifts, a book of poetry, a fragrant lavender lotion, a hand-knitted scarf. He learned to navigate the minefield of their new relationship, treading carefully around the raw wounds of betrayal. The hospital room, once a sterile space of pain and isolation, slowly transformed into a sanctuary of hesitant reconciliation. One evening, sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Isabella sat by the window, her gaze lost in the fading light. Arthur, hesitant, sat beside her. The scent of the lavender lotion clung to his hands. I saw your childhood photographs," Arthur began, his voice barely a whisper. "The ones your lawyer shared." His throat tightened. The pictures had shown a shared mischievous glint in their eyes, a similar curve to their smiles, undeniable proof of their bond. Isabella's shoulders trembled slightly. "They were happy memories," she said, her voice catching. "A life I never knew. A life we should have shared," Arthur corrected, the words heavy with regret. "I stole that life from you. I robbed you of a sister, a family." He felt the sting of tears welling up, a release after weeks of suppressed emotion. Silence hung in the air, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall. The smell of antiseptic was now faint, overshadowed by the sweetness of the sunflowers Arthur had brought earlier, their wilted heads a testament to the passing of time. The lingering scent of lavender competed with the chill autumn air seeping in through the slightly ajar window. Isabella turned to him, her eyes red-rimmed, yet strangely calm. "I'm still angry," she admitted softly, her voice laced with weariness and hurt. "But seeing those pictures, I saw you too. A little boy, full of life, like me, separated but connected." She paused, then added with a tiny, almost imperceptible smile, "We are connected, Arthur, in a way I never imagined." This acknowledgement, a tiny crack in the wall of her anger, was a breakthrough. The healing process had begun, slowly, painfully, but it had begun. The crisp autumn air, scented with wood smoke and decaying leaves, seeped into the hospital room. Isabella, wrapped in a thick blanket, watched the falling leaves swirl outside the window. Arthur, nervously fidgeting with the worn leather of his briefcase, sat opposite her. He cleared his throat, the sound brittle and uncertain. I've been thinking," he began, his voice a low rumble, "about everything." He paused, avoiding her gaze. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words and years of regret. The only sound was the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor, a relentless reminder of Isabella's fragility. Isabella remained silent, her expression unreadable. The sunlight, filtering through the leaves, cast long shadows across her face, highlighting the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the faint lines etched around her eyes, lines carved by pain, by loneliness, by betrayal. Arthur swallowed hard. "About how I treated you, how I abandoned you." He finally met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of remorse and fear. He saw the flicker of hurt, but also something else, a glimmer of weariness, of acceptance. "It wasn't just the accident," he continued, his voice cracking slightly. "It was fear, selfishness. I didn't want the responsibility. I saw your disability as inconvenient, a burden." He winced, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Isabella sighed, a long, drawn-out breath that seemed to carry the weight of years of sorrow. "I know," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The words, though simple, held an immense weight. They were an acknowledgement, a quiet acceptance of the devastating truth. The air crackled with the unspoken understanding between them, an understanding born not of forgiveness, but of a shared past, a shared trauma, a shared blood. The scent of lavender, a faint ghost of Arthur's previous visits, still lingered in the air, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their fractured relationship. The ticking clock on the wall seemed to mock the slow, agonizing passage of time. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the vibrant autumn colors visible through the hospital window. Arthur, his expensive suit feeling strangely out of place, watched Isabella trace patterns on her blanket with a trembling hand. The silence between them was a tangible thing, thick with the weight of unspoken apologies and unresolved grief. He'd come seeking forgiveness, but the path to it felt longer, steeper than he'd ever imagined. "Isabella," he began, his voice rough with emotion, I need you to understand." He hesitated, searching for the right words that could possibly alleviate the pain he'd caused. The sunlight catching the silver in his hair emphasized the lines etched by regret around his eyes. Isabella didn't look up. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low and strained. "Understanding doesn't erase what you did, Arthur. It doesn't make the years of loneliness disappear." He saw the unshed tears welling in her eyes, a testament to a pain that ran deeper than any words could express. He flinched, the sharp sting of guilt familiar and unwelcome. He reached across the space between them, his hand hovering hesitantly over hers. He knew the gesture might be unwelcome, but the need to make some form of contact, to show his remorse, was overwhelming. He spoke quietly, choosing his words carefully. "I know that, but I want to try, to make amends, to be a brother." The last word hung in the air, fragile yet hopeful. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not forgiveness yet, but perhaps a crack in the wall of her hurt. The sound of distant sirens added an undercurrent of unease to the tense moment. Isabella finally met his gaze, her eyes filled with a complex mixture of sadness, anger, and a weary acceptance. "A brother?" she repeated, the words almost a whisper. She let out a shaky breath. After all this time? The question hung unanswered, yet it resonated with the emotional weight of the past years, a potent mix of betrayal and the hesitant first steps toward healing. The faint scent of lavender, a lingering memory of his past visits, seemed to hang between them, a frail reminder of a world that could have been. The crisp winter air bit at exposed skin as Isabella, bundled in a thick wool scarf, sat by the lake. The icy water mirrored the frozen landscape of her heart. Weeks had passed since Arthur's last visit, weeks filled with a confusing blend of resentment and something else, a tentative hope. She shivered, pulling the scarf tighter. The memory of his hesitant, "I want to be a brother," echoed in her mind, a fragile melody amidst the harsh dissonance of her pain. A rustling in the nearby bushes startled her. She turned, her breath misting in the cold air, to see Arthur emerge, his face etched with a weariness that mirrored her own. He carried a bouquet of snowdrops, their delicate white blooms a stark contrast to the bleak surroundings. He approached hesitantly, his gait stiff, his usual arrogance replaced by a quiet humility. "Isabella," he began, his voice barely a whisper above the wind's mournful sigh. I brought these." He offered the flowers, his hand trembling slightly. Isabella took them, her fingers brushing against his. A jolt of unexpected warmth shot through her. The scent of the snowdrops, delicate and sweet, was oddly comforting. "They're beautiful," she murmured, her voice thick with unshed tears. The icy grip on her heart loosened just a fraction. He sat beside her, the silence between them less heavy than before. The rhythmic lapping of the waves against the shore provided a melancholic counterpoint to their unspoken thoughts. "I know I can't undo the past," Arthur said, his voice raw with remorse. "But I want to be part of your future, however you want that to look." Isabella looked at him, truly looked at him, seeing not just the heartless millionaire, but a man grappling with his own demons. The guilt etched into his face was genuine, his remorse palpable. The image of the man who'd abandoned her was slowly fading, replaced by the man who now sat beside her, offering tentative reconciliation. "It won't be easy," she said, her voice still low, but with a hint of resolve. "The hurt, it's deep, but I am willing to try." She looked at the snowdrops, their fragile beauty a symbol of the tentative hope blooming within her. The lake, once a mirror to her desolation, now seemed to reflect a faint glimmer of a warmer, brighter future. The journey would be long, arduous, and filled with challenges. But for the first time in a long time, Isabella felt a faint stirring of warmth, a fragile promise of healing. The scent of lilies, sharp and sweet, hung heavy in the air of Isabella's meticulously restored cottage. Sunlight streamed through the newly installed bay window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the golden beams. Arthur, nervously fidgeting with the antique silver frame holding a faded photograph of them as children. A picture Isabella hadn't seen in decades, felt the familiar knot of guilt tighten in his stomach. He'd brought it, hoping it would bridge the chasm between them. "I found this," he said, his voice a low rumble, "in the attic of the old house. I never realized." He trailed off, unable to articulate the depth of his regret. Isabella, perched on a plush armchair, regarded the photo with a mixture of curiosity and guardedness. Her eyes, once filled with the vacant despair of her accident, now held a flicker of something else, a fragile hope, carefully concealed. "We look so much alike," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking grandfather clock in the hall. The resemblance was uncanny, a stark reminder of the years stolen, the family bond severed. He watched her, his heart aching with a newfound empathy. The opulent furnishings of his mansion felt a million miles away from this haven of quiet strength, a testament to Isabella's resilience. He saw not a victim, but a survivor, her spirit unbroken despite the hardships she'd endured. "I know I can't ask for forgiveness," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not yet, but I want you to know. I understand now. The cruelty, the selfishness. It was unforgivable." He paused, his gaze dropping to his hands. The silver frame felt cold against his skin, a stark contrast to the warmth blooming within him, a tentative warmth fueled by a desperate desire for atonement. Isabella looked up, her eyes meeting his. The years melted away, revealing a shared sorrow, a bond forged not in happy memories, but in the crucible of shared loss and rediscovered kinship. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a tear not of anguish, but of recognition. The fragile ice around her heart began to thaw. The journey toward healing had just begun, a path paved with remorse, forgiveness, and the unshakable strength of a family unexpectedly reunited. The crisp autumn air bit at Arthur's cheeks as he watched Isabella from the distance. He'd arranged for a wheelchair-accessible path to wind through the newly planted gardens of her cottage, a small gesture compared to the enormity of his past failings. The scent of wood smoke and damp earth mingled with the fragrance of late-blooming roses, a comforting contrast to the sterile scent of his mansion. He saw her now, laughing, her face lit by the setting sun, as she shared a joke with a young man, his arm casually resting on the back of her chair. A pang of something akin to jealousy pricked at him. It was fleeting, quickly replaced by a wave of relief. She was happy. He approached cautiously, the gravel crunching under his shoes a counterpoint to the gentle laughter drifting on the breeze. Isabella turned, her eyes widening slightly at his presence. The young man, introduced as Daniel, a physiotherapist, offered a polite nod before discreetly taking his leave. I didn't mean to interrupt," Arthur stammered, his carefully rehearsed words catching in his throat. The guilt, a constant companion, pressed heavily on his chest. Isabella's expression was unreadable, a carefully constructed mask of polite neutrality. "It's all right," she replied, her voice soft, a subtle tremor betraying her controlled composure. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken emotions. "Daniel's been wonderful," she finally said, her gaze drifting towards the disappearing figure. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Was she testing him? Gauging his reaction? Arthur swallowed hard. "I'm glad," he managed, the words feeling inadequate, pathetic even. He shifted his weight, acutely aware of the chasm that still separated them, a chasm deeper than any physical distance. I've been thinking," he began, searching for the right words to express the profound shift in his perspective, the agonizing regret that gnawed at him. The setting sun cast long shadows, painting the scene in hues of orange and purple, mirroring the complex emotions swirling within him. He longed to bridge the gap, to somehow make amends for the years of neglect, of callous disregard. But how? How could he ever truly atone? The cottage glowed warmly against the twilight. Inside, the scent of cinnamon and apples filled the air, a stark contrast to the sterile opulence of Arthur's mansion. Isabella, curled on the sofa, a patchwork quilt draped over her legs, smiled at a photograph. Daniel, her physiotherapist, sat opposite, his presence a comforting counterpoint to the loneliness that had once consumed her. The laughter that had reached Arthur earlier had faded, replaced by a quiet intimacy. "He's good for you, isn't he?" Arthur's voice, hesitant, broke the comfortable silence. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, the autumn chill clinging to his expensive coat. Isabella's smile softened, but her eyes held a reserve. "He is," she admitted, her voice low. "He helps me remember what it's like to feel things again." The unspoken words hung heavy, to feel things besides pain and betrayal. Arthur winced. The guilt, a familiar companion, tightened its grip. I understand if you can't forgive me, Asadesh." "Arthur," she interrupted, her voice firm, yet laced with a weariness that pierced him. "Forgiveness is a long road, a road I'm not sure I'm even ready to start down. But seeing you try, seeing you acknowledge what you did." A tear traced a path down her cheek. "It's a beginning." He stepped closer, the worn wooden floorboards creaking beneath his weight. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows that danced on her face, highlighting the resilience etched into her features. He longed to reach out, but hesitated, fearing rejection. I'm trying to be better," he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. "For you, for myself." She nodded, her gaze settling on the fire. The silence that followed wasn't tense, but contemplative, a space filled with the unspoken weight of shared history, of betrayal and tentative healing. The scent of apples and cinnamon, once comforting, now felt charged with the potent mixture of regret and fragile hope. Outside, the wind whispered secrets through the trees, a gentle lullaby to a slowly awakening conscience. The road to forgiveness was long, arduous, but perhaps, just perhaps, they were beginning to walk it together. The crisp winter air bit at Arthur's exposed skin as he walked through the park, the frosted grass crunching under his expensive shoes. He'd been coming here regularly, a silent pilgrimage to a bench overlooking the frozen lake. It was near this spot years ago that he'd first seen Isabella, her laughter echoing across the ice. The memory cut him like a shard of glass. He'd lost her then, through his own callous indifference. Now he was losing her again, in a different, more agonizing way. The guilt, a constant companion, gnawed at him. He'd poured money into Isabella's care, renovated her cottage, but material things couldn't bridge the chasm of his betrayal. He longed for a genuine connection, a sign that she might, someday, forgive him. He watched children laughing on the ice, their carefree joy a painful reminder of what he'd taken from Isabella, from himself. He pulled out a worn photograph from his pocket, a faded image of them as children, two smiling faces, unaware of the cruel fate that would separate them. His fingers traced the outline of their younger selves, a pang of grief piercing his chest. He hadn't known her then, yet the photograph whispered of a bond that transcended time and circumstance. The setting sun cast long shadows, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of orange and purple. The air grew colder, and he shivered, not entirely from the cold, He needed to do more. He knew more than just provide for her physical needs. He needed to earn her forgiveness, not just expect it. His heart ached with the weight of his past actions, a burden he knew he would carry for the rest of his life. He had to find a way to make amends, not just for Isabella, but for the shattered fragments of his own soul. He needed to rebuild his life, not on a foundation of wealth and self-interest, but on one built on compassion, on empathy, and on the fragile, hard-won bonds of family. The path ahead remained uncertain, but one thing was clear. His journey toward redemption had only just begun. The scent of lilies, Isabella's favorite, hung heavy in the air of her renovated cottage. Sunlight streamed through the newly installed bay window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the golden beams. Arthur stood awkwardly by the fireplace, a bouquet of lilies clutched in his hand. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Isabella sat by the window, her gaze lost in the distance. "Isabella," he began, his voice a low rumble. I wanted to see how you're—" He trailed off, unsure how to continue. He felt the familiar sting of guilt, a constant companion these past months. Isabella turned. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, now held a quiet sadness. "You've sent flowers," she stated, her voice even and devoid of emotion. "What else is new?" The words, sharp and cold, pierced him. He shifted his weight, the lilies feeling heavy in his hand. I wanted to apologize again. For everything." "Apologies don't mend broken bones, Arthur," she replied, her voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the weight of years of hurt. "They don't erase the past." She looked at him, a flicker of something, perhaps pity, crossing her features. "Or the fact that you abandoned me when I needed you most." He watched her, his throat tight with unshed tears. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a crushing burden he'd been carrying for too long. The silence returned, filled only with the soft ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. The scent of lilies, once comforting, now felt suffocating. He had so much to say, so much he needed to do, yet the words seemed to catch in his throat. He knew that forgiveness wouldn't come easily, if at all, but he also knew he couldn't give up. His journey of redemption, as difficult and uncertain as it was, had just begun. He had to keep trying, for her, and for himself. He had to earn the right to be part of her life, even as a brother. The simple act of being there, of showing that he cared, was the only start he could make. The setting sun cast long shadows across the room, painting the walls in shades of orange and deepening the somber mood. The following months were a slow, agonizing climb. Arthur, initially repelled by the revelation of his incestuous past with Isabella, found himself strangely drawn to her quiet resilience. He visited her regularly, the awkward silences punctuated by clumsy attempts at conversation. The renovated cottage, once a symbol of his callous disregard, now felt like a sanctuary of unspoken sorrow. The scent of lilies, once a suffocating reminder, became a symbol of his persistent efforts. One crisp autumn afternoon, sunlight filtering through the leaves painted dappled shadows on the floor, he found Isabella sketching in her garden. The gentle rustle of leaves accompanied the rhythmic scratching of her charcoal pencil. He watched her, a lump forming in his throat. Her face, etched with the scars of pain, still held a captivating beauty. He cleared his throat. "The roses are doing well," he offered, his voice barely a whisper above the wind. Isabella didn't look up. "Yes," she replied, her voice low and measured. "They're hardy." A long pause hung between them, filled only with the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant caw of a crow. He sat beside her, the cool earth a grounding presence beneath his hands. I've been thinking," he began, his voice catching slightly, "about the separation, about what happened." "It doesn't matter," she said abruptly, her voice tinged with the remnants of bitterness, snapping the pencil in two. "It's done. Over. And it certainly changed nothing about what you did to me." He reached out, his hand hovering over hers before retracting. "I know, and I know I can't undo any of it. But I want to be here for you, Isabella." As your brother. She finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a complex mix of pain and something akin to tentative hope. The years of neglect, the shattering of her trust, the physical pain that still clung to her all etched deeply onto her face. Yet, a flicker of something, acceptance, seemed to spark within those sorrowful depths. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves like whispers of a shared past. The shadows lengthened, stretching across the garden, mirroring the long road ahead. But for the first time, Arthur felt a glimmer of hope. A fragile understanding began to bloom between them, a fragile beginning of a bond forged in shared trauma, and the slow, painstaking process of redemption. The winter sun cast long shadows across the snow-dusted landscape. Inside, the warmth of the fireplace chased away the chill, but not the lingering tension between Arthur and Isabella. He watched her, a fragile silhouette against the firelight, her hand gently tracing the worn wood of her walking stick. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Arthur spoke, his voice rough with emotion. I've started therapy. He saw her flinch, a subtle movement barely perceptible. It's not easy, he admitted, his gaze dropping to his hands. But I need to understand why I acted the way I did. Isabella turned, her eyes filled with a weary sadness. Understanding won't bring back what you took, she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the weight of years of hurt. The scent of wood smoke and pine mingled with the faint, lingering perfume she always wore, a ghostly reminder of a life they'd shared, a life cruelly shattered. He nodded, accepting the truth of her words. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a constant, gnawing ache. He reached for a small, intricately carved wooden box, a piece he'd found in the attic of his childhood home, a hidden piece of their shared past. He pushed it towards her, his hand trembling slightly. I found this. I think it belonged to our mother. Isabella's breath hitched. A flicker of recognition, a faint spark of connection, ignited in her eyes as she gently opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a delicate silver locket engraved with intertwined initials, A and I. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the intricate carvings. This shared relic, this tangible piece of their forgotten history, breached the wall of bitterness she'd painstakingly built around her heart. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't heavy with unspoken words, but filled with the shared weight of a past rediscovered, a connection rekindled amidst the ashes of betrayal. The fire crackled merrily, a hopeful counterpoint to the somber beauty of their shared sorrow and the tentative, fragile beginning of healing. Outside, the snow fell softly, blanketing the world in a hush of forgiveness. Pressed down on him, gnawing ache. Intricately carved wooden box, of his childhood home, a hidden piece of their. He pushed it towards her, his. I found this. I think. Isabella's breath hitched. A faint spark of connection, gently opened the box. Nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay blurring the intricate carvings. This tangible piece of their forgotten. The wall of bitterness was different this time. It wasn't heavy with unspoken words, but filled with the shared weight of a past rediscovered. Of betrayal. The Gently open the box. Nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay blurring the intricate carvings. This tangible piece of their forgotten the wall of bitterness. Unspoken words, but filled with the shared waves of betrayal. The gently open the box. Reach the wall of bitterness.